The air along the Niobrara smells of dry pine resin in early September, sharp and clean, the kind of scent that makes the country feel generous. But the bark is wrong. Broad plates of it lie beneath the ponderosa, where no storm has knocked them loose, and the ground in the shade holds frost that should not exist for another month. A woman kneels beside a cabin wall, pressing her palm against the logs the way a doctor presses a chest. She does not look at the sky. She looks at the place where the wind enters her house. Behind her, a fresh grave has not yet settled. On August 29th, 1887, the freight wagon rolled into Kettleben with one wheel bent so badly it ticked against the undercarriage with every revolution. The young driver, barely 20, hands shaking on the reins, pulled the team to a stop beside the gate of the Weller claim and could not bring himself to climb down. Almeda Baines Weller stood 10 paces from the wagon. She had been stripping the last ears from the kitchen garden when the sound reached her. Not the wheel. The flies. Flies did not gather like that in the first cold wind of autumn, unless something on the wagon bed had stopped breathing. She walked to the tailgate. Josiah lay on his side beneath a folded canvas, one arm bent beneath him at an angle that told her everything. Pine pitch darkened his sleeve where the freight load had caught him. Blood had dried into the weave of his coat from elbow to wrist. His boots were still laced. His hat was gone. The driver said Josiah had crawled halfway out before the axle settled a second time. Almeda did not ask him to repeat it. She reached past the canvas and removed Josiah's coat. Inside the left pocket, her fingers found a folded receipt sour, payment for 6 cords of winterwood from a cutter near Long Pine, dated 4 days earlier. Wood Josiah had ordered and never collected. Wood that now belonged to a dead man's account. Behind her, 9-year-old Rue stood in the cabin doorway holding a tin cup she had filled for her grandfather's supper. The cup shook once in Rue's hand, and the water inside made no sound at all. Almeda signed for the body with a hand that did not tremble because trembling would come later, after the driver left, after the neighbors who would hear had not yet arrived, after Rue had been put to bed with a question Almeda could not answer. For now, she folded the receipt into her apron and began counting what Josiah's death had left behind. The math destroyed every plan they had made. $31.40 in the tin box beneath the bed. A 16 by 20-foot log cabin, 3 years occupied, but not yet proved. One aging mare with $94 still owed on the combined debt for the horse, the stove, and claim improvements Josiah had financed on promise. 2 1/4 cords of seasoned wood split and stacked beside the south wall, enough to heat the cabin for perhaps 5 weeks if the winter stayed mild, which no winter in northern Nebraska had ever done. A crosscut saw, an axe, a froe, an auger, a draw knife, a shovel, and a splitting maul. One granddaughter whose mother had died 2 winters earlier and whose only living relative now stood beside a freight wagon trying to remember whether the woodcutter near Long Pine would honor a dead man's receipt. She needed at least 8 additional cords to survive a hard winter. 8 cords meant roughly 128 cubic feet of split fuel per cord, over 1,000 cubic feet of wood that had to be felled, hauled, split, and stacked before the ground froze too hard to work. She had 13 weeks. She had no money to hire a cutter. She had no close relatives, no passage east, and a claim that would revert if she abandoned residence before the 5-year requirement was met. The claim and the 160 acres of timbered river frontage were the only inheritance Rue might ever receive. Leaving was not an option. Staying was not survivable. That night, after the driver had gone and Rue slept curled against the wall with Josiah's coat pulled over her shoulders, Almeda sat at the table and pressed a goose feather against the seam where the north wall met the corner post. The feather flattened sideways every time the wind gusted, She could feel the moving air on her wrist without touching the logs. The cabin was not a shelter. It was a sieve with a stove inside it. She counted the sticks she burned before dawn. 14. At that rate, the 2 1/4 cords would last 31 days. Winter would last 120. 3 days after the burial, Nell Brackett walked the 1/4 mile from her store to the Weller claim, carrying a cloth sack of dried beans, a small jar of lard, and a question she had been asked to deliver. Nell was 45, widowed herself 3 years earlier, and the only person in Kettle Bend who kept written accounts of everything that passed through her hands. She ran the settlement's combined store and post room with a pencil behind her ear and a ledger open on the counter from dawn until the lamp went out. She liked Almeda. She also liked facts, and the facts about the Weller cabin were not kind. She set the beans on the table and told Almeda that Amasa Hoxie wanted to inspect the house. Almeda asked why. Nell said because she had asked him to, because someone with experience needed to look at the cabin and tell Almeda what it would cost to make it safe, and Amasa had built more houses than any man between Long Pine and the Niobrara. Almeda said she already knew what it would cost. Nell said knowing and hearing it from Amasa were different things, because Amasa's word carried weight with the claim association and might open a line of credit. Almeda agreed, not because she wanted Amasa's opinion, but because refusing it would make her look afraid of the answer. Amasa Hoxie arrived the following morning on a wagon loaded with sawn boards for a house he was framing on the East Ridge. He was 52, built like a man who had spent 30 years lifting timber, and he carried a folding rule in his vest pocket the way other men carried tobacco. He had built barns and frame houses across Iowa before coming to Nebraska, and he believed in straight walls, tight joints, and a stove large enough to fight the weather head-on. He did not believe in half measures, old cabins, or explanations from people who had not driven their own nails. He walked the Weller cabin the way a doctor examines a patient he expects to lose. He ran his hand along the north wall and pressed his thumb into the chinking between the 4th and 5th logs. The mud crumbled. He checked 6 joints and found gaps at all of them, some wide enough to pass a knife blade through. He stood in the doorway and sighted along the frame. The door hung 1 inch out of square. The north wall had developed a slight outward bow where the foundation log had shifted during the previous spring's thaw. The roof shed water adequately, but had no diagonal bracing against lateral wind. The stove was a number 7 sound, adequate for a cabin half this size in a mild climate. Insufficient for a Nebraska winter in a building that leaked air through every seam. He told Almeda what she already suspected, but hearing it delivered in Amasa's flat carpenter's voice made it worse. The north wall needed rechinking along its full length. 6 joints required packing with new lime morite and oakum. The door frame needed resetting. The roof needed at least 4 diagonal braces. The stove either needed replacing with a number 9 or supplementing with a second unit. And the existing wood supply, he looked at the pile beside the south wall and shook his head, would carry her into late October if she burned carefully. November would kill her. Almeda asked what all of that would cost. Amasa unfolded his rule, measured nothing, and gave his estimate from memory. A new inner board lining against the worst walls, $14 for lumber, $6 for labor if she could find someone willing to work on credit. Purchase felt for the joints, $8. A second stove or a larger replacement, $20 to $30 depending on what Sloat had in stock. Delivered firewood, 8 cords minimum at the going rate of $2.25 per cord, $18. Total, $68 before any contingency. And that assumed the roof did not need replacing, the foundation did not shift further, and the winter cooperated. Almeda had $31.40. She owed $94. Amasa folded his rule and put it back in his vest. He looked at Rue, who was sitting on the stump beside the woodpile, pretending to read a book she had already finished twice. He said what he believed to be true, and what every experienced settler in Kettlebend would have agreed with. The cabin could not be made safe for the money Almeda had. She should consider selling the claim, settling the debt, and purchasing rail passage to a town where she could find work, near people who could help with the child. Almeda asked who would buy a claim with an unsafe cabin, $94 of debt, and a winter approaching. Amasa did not have an answer for that. He said he was sorry about Josiah. He said the beans Nell had brought would not last 2 weeks. He said the settlement would help where it could, but 13 families were all preparing for the same winter, and none of them had surplus. Then he climbed back onto his wagon and drove toward the east ridge, where the house he was building had straight walls, tight joints, and enough stove to fight the cold by force. Almeda stood in the doorway and watched him go. The wind came through the gap beside her shoulder and moved the hair at the back of Rue's neck across the room. That evening, Almeda did something she had not done since arriving in Nebraska. She sat at the table with a candle, a piece of wrapping paper, and a stub of pencil, and she drew the cabin from above, a simple rectangle, 16 by 20 feet, with the stove marked in the center and the door on the south wall. Then she drew the wind. Arrows from the northwest, because that was where the winter gales came from. Arrows from the north, because January sent its worst straight down from the Dakotas. Arrows curving around the corners, because wind did not stop at walls. It searched for the path of least resistance, found every crack, and poured through. She had watched her father do this once in a Maine logging camp when she was 12 years old. He had not drawn arrows. He had knelt beside a wall, held a feather near a joint, and watched the plume flatten sideways. Cold stands still, he had told her. Wind goes hunting. Her father had cut timber and maintained logging camp cookhouses along the Penobscot. In Maine, when a camp was temporary and no one intended to build permanent improvements, the crews banked the outer walls with whatever was available: brush, split cordwood, spare canvas, packed snow, not because the banking generated warmth, because it intercepted the moving air before the air reached the wall. A banked camp did not need less fire. It kept more of the fire's heat inside. Almeda had never applied the lesson in Nebraska because Josiah had always planned to improve the cabin properly: new chinking, board lining, a bigger stove, the proper way, Amasa's way, the way that cost $68. But Josiah was dead, and $68 might as well have been $600. She looked at the woodpile drawn on her map. 2 1/4 cords stacked against the south wall where it was easy to reach. The south wall, the side the winter wind barely touched. The next morning, before the sun cleared the ridge, Almeda moved the woodpile. She unstacked every piece and restacked it against the north wall, packing it tight against the logs from the foundation to a height of roughly 4 feet. It took her most of the day. Her shoulders burned, her hands cracked where the bark scraped across old calluses. Rue carried the smaller splits and stacked them where Almeda pointed. By evening, the north wall had a 4-foot layer of cordwood pressed against its entire length. That night, Almeda placed a feather beside the north wall seam that had fluttered all week. The feather moved, but gently, a slow drift instead of a sideways snap. She placed a second feather beside the east wall, where no wood had been stacked. That feather flattened against the chinking every time the wind gusted. She did not conclude that the cordwood was making the cabin warmer. The stove was doing the same work it had always done. What she concluded was simpler and more important. The wood was taking the wind first. The next morning confirmed it. Along the north wall joints, the thin line of frost that had been feathering through the mud chinking for weeks was dry. Behind the stacked wood, The mud was intact. Along the exposed east wall, frost still crept inward wherever the chinking had cracked. Same stove, same night, same cabin, different exposure. Almeda wrote 4 words on the back of Josiah's wood receipt. Wood belongs beside walls. The winter fuel supply was not something to be stored conveniently and burned. It was temporary construction material. If she could surround the cabin with enough cordwood and dried grass to break the wind on every side, the stove would not need to fight the moving air. The heat would stay inside longer. The chinking would matter less. The cabin's worst weakness, its leaking joints, would become secondary to a problem she could actually solve with the materials she already had. But the idea, in its first form, was lethally simple. Stack wood against every wall, stuff grass into every gap, seal the cabin inside a shell of fuel, and pray. She sketched it that night, a continuous wall of cordwood surrounding the cabin on all 4 sides, packed floor to eaves, with bundled prairie grass filling every void. The sketch nearly killed her before she drove a single post. Orson Vickery saw the drawing 3 days later, pinned beneath a stone on Nell Brackett's counter, where Almeda had left it while purchasing salt on the last of her credit. Orson was 72. He moved slowly because his lungs had been damaged by years of charcoal smoke around army posts and frontier forges, and he sat on Nell's bench most mornings because the walk from his claim to the store was exactly the distance his breathing could manage without stopping. He had been a civilian carpenter and wagon repairman for the better part of 4 decades. He understood winter quarters, roof loads, draft control, wood cribs, chimneys, and the dozen ways a man could build something that looked right and still froze to death inside it. He picked up the drawing. He studied it for a long time. Then he turned it over and read the 4 words on the back. When Almeda returned for the drawing, Orson was still sitting on the bench. He did not introduce himself with pleasantries. He introduced himself with 5 questions that each pointed at a way her design would fail. First, rain. If she packed cordwood directly against the cabin logs, the first autumn rain would wick moisture into the space between the wood and the wall. Wet logs against wet chinking meant rot, mold, and a cabin that would be weaker by spring than it was now. Second, grass against logs. Dried prairie grass, stuffed into direct contact with the cabin walls, would trap moisture from inside the cabin. Warm air escaping through the chinking would condense against the cold grass and create a hidden layer of damp that could heat dangerously in a confined space. Third, fire. One spark from the stove chimney landing on a continuous wall of dried grass packed against a wooden cabin. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Fourth, structure. A 6-foot stack of cordwood without cribbed ends would spread outward under its own weight, especially when the lower courses froze and thawed unevenly. By midwinter, the pile would have gaps wide enough to admit the wind she was trying to stop. Fifth, the roof. If she tied a covering directly to the cabin to keep snow off the wood, the added weight and lateral stress would pull the original walls apart. The cabin was not built to carry a second structure. Almeda listened to all 5 points. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she asked the only question that mattered. Was the idea wrong? Orson looked at the drawing again. He looked at the 4 words on the back. He looked at Almeda, who had not flinched at a single objection and had not tried to defend a plan she already suspected was dangerous. He said, "The notion is sound. Your first drawing is trying to kill you." Almeda sat down on the bench beside him and asked if he could show her how to stop it from doing that. Orson said he would look at the site. Nothing more. He arrived at the Weller claim the following morning, walking slowly with a brace, an auger, and a plumb bob. He studied the cabin, the terrain, the wind exposure, and the distance to the nearest trees. He drove a stick into the ground 7 feet from the north wall and asked Almeda whether she could set a post there without disturbing the cabin's foundation. She said she could. He drove sticks at 7 feet from every wall. When he finished, the stakes described a rectangle roughly 30 by 34 feet, the cabin floating inside it like a smaller box inside a larger one. The outer structure would stand on its own. 22 peeled pine posts set into the ground, carrying their own roof on independent rafters that sloped from near the cabin's eave height down to the outer wall. The cabin would not support the gallery. The gallery would not lean on the cabin. They would share only the space between them. That space, 7 feet deep on all 4 sides, would be divided into bays. Some bays would hold cross-stacked cordwood. Some would hold dried prairie grass contained behind removable lath screens, never packed directly against the cabin logs. One bay on the east wall would remain completely empty around the chimney, with bare earth below, and no combustible material within reach of sparks. One bay would form an entrance vestibule with 2 doors, one outer, one inner, so that opening the gallery never opened the cabin directly to the wind. The outer wall would be clad in overlapping pine slabs with controlled ventilation slots beneath the eaves. Wind would strike the slabs. Some air would enter the gallery, but slowly through narrow gaps, stripped of its force. By the time it reached the cabin walls, it would no longer be the gale that had crossed 200 miles of open prairie. It would be something the chinking could actually stop. Almeda revised her sketch 3 times that afternoon, while Orson corrected her measurements. He did not soften his criticism. He struck errors with the blunt end of his pencil and told her what would fail and why. But he also did not leave. He stayed until the light faded because Almeda kept pace with his corrections and twice caught mistakes he had overlooked, including a diagonal measurement that would have placed one corner post 2 inches off square. The revised plan required 22 posts, 48 rafters and braces, 9 cords of wood, 180 hand-bound bundles of dried prairie grass, 65 pounds of nails and spikes, hinges for 2 gallery doors, and slab wood for the outer walls and roof. Estimated cash expense, $17.85. The remaining cost was labor, more than 600 person-hours of cutting, hauling, setting, stacking, binding, nailing, and roofing before the ground froze. Almeda had 11 weeks. She had 1 aging mare, 1 set of hand tools, 1 old man with damaged lungs, and 1 9-year-old granddaughter who could carry cut grass but not swing an axe. Nell Brackett heard the plan before anyone else because Almeda needed to buy nails and salt on what remained of her credit. Nell did not laugh. Nell never laughed at plans. She interrogated them. She asked how Almeda intended to burn fuel that had become part of the wall. If the cordwood was the windbreak and the windbreak was the fuel supply, then every fire weakened the shelter. By late January, the gallery would be half empty, and the wind would find whatever side had been consumed first. Almeda had expected the question. She laid 12 flat stones on Nell's counter, each representing roughly 3/4 of a cord. She arranged them around a square she scratched in the wood, the cabin. She removed stones first from the south side, where the prevailing winter wind was weakest. Protection remained deepest on the northwest, where the gale struck hardest. As she emptied a bay, she moved the removable lath screens outward to create a thinner but continuous barrier. If a bay stood empty, she could pack it with brush bundles, snow blocks, or shifted panels from a less critical wall. Nell watched the demonstration. She counted the stones. She calculated the burn rate Almeda described, roughly one-third cord per week in severe weather, and divided it into the total supply. Then she delivered her verdict with the precision of a woman who kept ledgers for a living. You have turned your woodpile into a clock. Every fire makes the house weaker. Almeda admitted that Nell was right. The design had a built-in countdown. The shelter would be strongest on the first day of winter and weakest on the last. If the worst weather arrived early, the gallery would hold. If it arrived late, after weeks of burning, the margins would be thinner. The design therefore required a rule: consume from the sheltered side, replace every emptied bay with whatever material was available, and never open two adjacent bays during a storm. Nell did not say she believed it would work. She said she would sell Almeda the nails at cost and extend the credit through November. That was not belief. It was the calculated decision of a woman who understood that Almeda had no alternative and that refusing the credit would not make the winter shorter. Harlan Sloat found out about the gallery the same way he found out about everything in Kettlebend. Because his mill was the only source of sawn lumber, nails, stove parts, and credit within a day's ride, and nothing could be built without passing through his hands. Sloat was 41, sharp-featured, and possessed of the particular confidence that came from being the only man in a settlement who could extend a loan. He owned the sawmill, the largest house, and a growing list of debts that other settlers owed him. He had been promoting freestanding frame cottages, modern square, properly sited, as the future of Kettlebend, and he had offered to buy Almeda's timbered river frontage twice since Josiah's death. The pines along the Niobrara and the access to water were worth far more than the $120 he dangled, and both of them knew it. He found Almeda on her knees marking post holes with sharpened sticks around the cabin perimeter. He invited Amasa and two mill workers to come look at what he called the widow's barn without livestock. The four men stood at the edge of the marked rectangle while Almeda continued measuring. Amasa walked the perimeter. He counted the stakes. He looked at the 7-foot gap between the cabin wall and the nearest postmark. He looked at the roof line Almeda had scratched on a board nailed to the south wall. Then he said the words that would follow Almeda through every conversation in Kettlebend for the next 4 months. "A house needs walls, Widow Weller, not a woodpile wearing a roof." Sloat laughed. The mill workers looked at each other. One of them repeated the line that evening at Nell's counter, and by morning it had traveled to every occupied claim in the settlement. Children began calling the project Weller's Coffin. Men at the mill wagered how much snow the outer roof could hold before the whole thing collapsed inward and buried the cabin. A woman whose husband had died of pneumonia the previous winter told Nell that Almeda was building her own grave and stacking the dirt herself. Sloat did not stop at mockery. When Almeda came to purchase small quantities of nails, 10 pounds at a time, which was all she could afford, he refused to sell at the normal rate. He insisted she purchase a full keg of 100 pounds on credit, secured against the river frontage. Almeda refused. 2 days later, Sloat ordered his mill hands to burn the slab offcuts that accumulated beside the saw. Slab wood, the rounded outer cut stripped from logs before squaring, was normally sold cheaply or given away. Almeda had counted on buying it at a few cents per wagon load for the gallery's outer walls. She stood at the edge of the mill yard and watched the pile burn. Sloat stood on his porch and watched her watch. He did not need to say anything. The message was legible in the smoke. The man who controlled the settlement's materials did not intend for the gallery to be built. But Nell Brackett sold nails at cost, 4 pounds at a time, wrapped in brown paper and recorded in her ledger, and Almeda's axe did not require Sloat's permission. On September 14th, 11 weeks before January, Almeda drove the first post. Orson arrived at dawn with his brace, auger, and plumb bob. He said he would give her 4 hours, no more. His lungs could not tolerate a full day of outdoor labor, and he had made no promise beyond looking at the site. He stayed until dark. He stayed because Almeda kept pace with him, because when he set the plumb line for the first corner post, she checked it from 2 directions without being told, because when they augured the post hole and found soft soil at 18 inches, she asked whether the post needed a stone pad beneath it before he could raise the objection, because when he noticed a hairline split forming along the grain of the first post as they tamped it into place, she had already seen it and was reaching for the maul to drive a wedge below the split before it could travel. Orson had spent 40 years working beside men who followed instructions and men who understood wood. The difference was visible in the first hour. Almeda understood wood. She understood it the way her father had understood it, not as material to be purchased and assembled, but as a substance with grain, moisture, memory, and the capacity to fail in ways that announced themselves quietly before they became catastrophic. He did not say any of this. He set the second post and adjusted the diagonal measurement against the first. When the numbers matched, he moved to the third. By the time the light faded, 6 posts stood in a line along the north wall. 16 remained to be set. The mare was too exhausted to haul another log. Almeda's right hand was bleeding where the auger handle had torn the skin between her thumb and forefinger. Rue had carried water to them 4 times and was asleep on the cabin step with sawdust in her hair. Orson sat on the chopping block and breathed carefully through his damaged lungs. He did not promise to return. He said the posts would need to be braced before the first wind or they would lean before the roof went on. Almeda asked whether she should brace them that night. Orson said the wind would wait until morning. He did not say how he knew. He returned at dawn. 78 days remained until January. The first hard frost was already visible on shaded ground. Pine bark along the Niobrara was separating in broad dry plates, and the squirrels were stripping cones with a fury that Almeda's father would have recognized as preparation for something worse than ordinary cold. She had mentioned her worry to Amasa 4 days earlier, mentioned the dry bark, the early frost, the animal behavior. She had used her father's phrase, black frost, a dry, penetrating, cold wave that went through walls the way water went through sand. Amasa had looked at her the way a carpenter looks at a nail that has been driven crooked. "Trees do not issue weather bulletins, Widow Weller." His objection was correct enough to hurt. Bark was not a thermometer. Squirrels were not meteorologists. The observations might mean nothing. A dry autumn, an early season, the ordinary fluctuations that every frontier settler learned to ignore, because reacting to every natural signal would leave no time for work. But Almeda remembered another thing her father had taught her. He had said that the camps that froze were not the ones where winter arrived unexpectedly. They were the ones where winter arrived exactly on time and found no one ready. She drove the 7th post on September 15th. The sun was warm. The breeze was light. The winter was 77 days away, and everything about the weather said there was still time. The feather beside the north wall seam said otherwise. Every night, it lay nearly flat. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could see every flaw in your work but none of the reason you had to finish it? She owed $94. She had $26.15 remaining after buying nails and salt. Rue needed shoes before the snow came. The mare was losing weight. The north wall's chinking was crumbling faster than she could patch it. Sloat had burned her cheapest source of lumber. The settlement thought she was building a monument to grief. And the gallery was 6 posts out of 22. Almeda stood at the northeast corner of the marked perimeter, where the seventh post waited in the ground, and looked at the cabin she was trying to save. The door hung crooked. The north wall bowed outward. The chinking was failing. The stove was too small. The woodpile, now stacked against the north wall where she had moved it, covered one side of a building that leaked on every side. Between the cabin and the winter, she had 11 weeks, 600 hours of labor, a 72-year-old man with broken lungs, and a child who could carry grass but not drive nails. The wind came through the open framework of the unbuilt gallery and passed through the cabin wall without slowing. She picked up the auger and walked to the 8th postmark. Orson returned every morning for the next 9 days. He never promised the night before. He simply appeared at dawn, carrying his brace and plumb bob wrapped in oilcloth, walking the quarter-mile from his claim at the pace his lungs allowed. He did not explain why he kept coming. Almeda did not ask. On the 3rd morning, he taught her how to check opposing diagonals. The cabin was not square. 3 years of frost heave settling, and a foundation log that had shifted during spring thaw had pulled the north wall slightly outward and rotated the southwest corner nearly an inch from true. Almeda had been measuring the gallery posts from the cabin walls, which meant the outer structure was inheriting every flaw in the inner one. Orson stopped her at the 9th post. He drove a stake at the intended northeast corner and another at the intended southwest corner. Then he ran a cord between them and measured. He drove stakes at the northwest and southeast corners and ran a second cord. The two diagonals differed by 3 1/4 inches. He did not explain the geometry. He showed her the cords and asked which building she wanted the wind to find, a square one or a crooked one. A crooked gallery would have gaps where the bays met the posts. Gaps meant wind. Wind meant the entire 7-foot buffer was compromised at its joints, exactly where the cabin's chinking was already failing. Almeda pulled 2 posts she had already set and reset them to match the corrected diagonals. It cost her a full day. But when the cords crossed again, the difference was less than half an inch, and every bay would meet its post flush. Orson watched her pull those posts without complaint and said the first thing he had said that sounded like approval. A wrong post stays wrong through every storm. A right post only needs to be set once. He was teaching her, and both of them knew it, and neither of them named what was happening because naming it would have introduced an obligation that Orson's lungs might not let him keep. On September the 24th, 10 posts stood and 12 remained. The mayor could haul 4 posts per day from the pine draw a half-mile north, where Almeda felled standing dead wood and stripped bark with the draw knife. Each post weighed between 80 and 130 pounds, depending on diameter. Each hole required augering through 18 inches of soil and tamping with stone and packed earth. Each post needed a temporary diagonal brace nailed at chest height to hold it upright until the top rail connected it to its neighbors. Almeida's right shoulder had begun locking at night. She woke every morning with her arm pressed against her chest and spent 10 minutes working it loose before she could lift the axe. The skin between her thumb and forefinger, torn on the first day, had scabbed, split, reopened, and scabbed again until the callus that formed was half scar tissue. She had lost 6 pounds since Josiah's death, and her collarbone showed through her dress in a way that made Nell press extra flour into the supply bag without recording it in the ledger. Rue did what a 9-year-old could do. She carried water. She stacked stripped bark for kindling. She heated stones on the stove at night, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them against Almeida's shoulder and hip while her grandmother slept. She did not complain. She did not ask when the building would be finished. She asked once whether the wind could blow the posts down before the roof went on, and Almeda told her that was what the braces were for, and Rue went outside and checked every brace with her hand to make sure the nails were tight. On the 11th day, Almeda made a mistake that nearly ended the project. She had been saving sound timber for the high-traffic northwest corner, where the wind pressure would be greatest. The southwest corner, which faced away from the prevailing gale, seemed less critical. She set 2 posts there that she knew were marginal, slight discoloration along the heartwood, a softness in the grain that she told herself was surface weathering. Orson arrived the next morning, walked to the southwest corner, and struck the nearest post with the pole of his axe. The center collapsed into brown powder. Dry rot had hollowed the core, while the outer shell maintained its shape. The post looked sound. It was a tube. Orson struck the second post. Same result. The shell cracked open and spilled a column of powdered wood that smelled of damp earth and decay. He did not raise his voice. He stood beside the ruined posts and waited for Almeda to speak first. She said she had known they were marginal. Orson said marginal was a word people used when they did not want to say the word rotten. Almeda said she had no sound posts left in the pile and would need 2 more days to fell, haul, and strip replacements. Orson said 2 days was what it cost to lie to herself about the quality of the wood. A weak post did not fail when she built it. It waited until she trusted it. It waited until the worst night of the worst storm, when she could not see the damage, could not reach the corner, and could not replace what had already given way. The post would choose its own moment, and it would choose badly. Almeda pulled both posts. She hitched the mare and rode to the pine draw. She felled 2 straight deadwood pines, stripped them, and hauled them back in pieces because the mare could not drag a full log through the brush. She re-augured the holes, reset the posts, braced them, and checked the diagonals. It cost her 2.5 days. The calendar read September 28th. 12 posts stood. 10 remained. 67 days until January. The temperature had dropped into the 30s at night, and frost was forming on the grass before dawn. Phase 2 began on the 1st of October. The cribbed wood bays. Orson taught her the method on the north wall's first bay, and the lesson was physical, not verbal. He stacked 4 courses of split cord wood while she watched, then dismantled them and made her rebuild each course from memory. The principle was cross-stacking. Each course alternated direction, splits running east-west, then north-south, then east-west again. The alternation created a self-bracing structure that resisted outward spread. Long, straight pieces went at the corners where the bay met the posts. Each course tilted slightly inward, no more than 1/2 inch per foot of height, so that gravity pushed the stack against itself rather than against the outer wall. Tall bays, those above 4 feet, needed tiebacks, lengths of rope or wire running from the top course to an independent rail behind the stack, preventing the upper rows from toppling outward during vibration or freeze-thaw cycles. Beneath every bay, Orson insisted on drainage. 4 inches of open air between the lowest course and the ground, achieved by laying the first splits across a pair of foundation logs set on flat stones. If snow melted against the outer wall and water ran beneath the gallery, it had to pass under the wood, not through it. Wet bottom courses meant rot. Rot meant collapse. Collapse meant a gap in the windbreak exactly where the wind would find it. Almeda stacked the first 3 bays alone while Orson supervised. Each bay held roughly 3/4 of a cord. 3 bays meant 2 1/4 cords in place. All of the wood she had started with, now positioned against the north wall where it would do the most good. But the gallery needed 9 cords total. 6 3/4 remained to be cut. Progress marker, 3 cords stacked, 6 cords required. 59 days until January. The fuel shortage struck on October 4th, when Almeda rode the mare to the woodcutter near Long Pine to claim Josiah's paid order. The cutter's yard was half empty. He recognized the receipt, looked at it for a long time, and told Almeda that the load had been sold 2 weeks earlier. To Harlan Sloat. Sloat had presented a claim of prior purchase, backed by a note that Josiah had allegedly signed assigning the wood order as partial payment against the mare debt. Almeda had never seen such a note. She said so. The cutter shrugged. He said Sloat had cash, and the note looked proper. He said he was sorry about Josiah. He said he had no spare wood to sell at any price because every cutter between Long Pine and Valentine was working flat to fill orders before the ground froze. Almeda rode back to Kettleben with an empty wagon and a receipt worth nothing. She did not confront Sloat. She could not prove the note was forged, and a public accusation against the settlement's only source of credit would isolate her further. Instead, she began cutting deadfall herself. The mare could haul roughly a quarter cord per trip from the pine draw. Each trip took 4 hours, an hour to walk the mare there, an hour to load, an hour to walk back, and an hour to unload and stack. 4 trips per day was the maximum before the mare needed rest. 1 cord per day in perfect conditions, which never held because the axe needed sharpening, the harness needed mending. Deadfall trees were scattered and often half rotten, and Almeida's shoulder locked worse with every passing week. Orson could not swing the axe for more than 10 minutes before his breathing failed. He split wood at the claim while Almeda hauled, but his output was a fraction of what a healthy man could produce. The numbers were merciless. 6 3/4 cords to cut, haul, and stack. At 3/4 of a cord per day, the realistic rate, not the theoretical one. She needed 9 more days of perfect hauling weather, but October in northern Nebraska was not 9 straight days of anything. Rain stopped the work for 2 days. A broken harness strap cost half a day. The mare threw a shoe and limped for 3 days before Almeda could walk her to the blacksmith and pay the 50 cents she could not afford. By October 15th, 5 1/2 cords were stacked. 3 1/4 cords remained. 49 days until January, and the first snow had not yet fallen. On the evening of October 18th, Orson placed 3 saucers of fine wood ash along the north wall inside the cabin. He positioned them carefully, one beside a joint that was fully exposed, with no gallery bay behind it, one beside a joint that stood behind a completed bay of cross-stacked cordwood, and one beside a joint that stood behind a bay filled with dried grass bundles behind lath screens. Then he closed the door, banked the stove, and told Almeda and Rue to sit at the table and watch. The wind picked up after dark, pushing from the northwest at perhaps 20 miles per hour. Not a gale, not a storm, just the ordinary autumn wind that crossed the open prairie every night. At the exposed joint, a gust sent ash skittering inward across the floor. The line of gray powder stretched 8 inches from the saucer before it stopped. Almeda could feel the draft on her ankle from 4 feet away. At the joint behind the cordwood bay, the ash barely stirred. A faint drift, less than an inch, showed that air was still moving, but slowly, robbed of pressure, arriving at the chinking with so little force that the existing mud held. At the joint behind the grass bay, the ash did not move at all. Rue smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since Josiah's death, and the expression was so unexpected that Orson looked away, and Almeda pressed her hand flat against the table to keep herself steady. The ash told the whole story, not warmth. The stove provided warmth, protection. The gallery bays did not generate heat. They interrupted speed. They forced the wind to slow, to turn, to lose its power against the intermediary material before it reached the wall it intended to penetrate. The cabin's chinking, which failed against a direct gale, held against the weakened remainder. But most of the cabin was still exposed. The north wall was partially protected. The northwest corner had two completed bays. The west wall had posts, but no stacked fuel. The south and east walls had nothing. The victory was real. It was also less than a quarter of what she needed. 4 days later, Amasa Hoxie returned. He did not come to help. He came because Nell had mentioned the ash test at the store, and Amasa was not a man who could hear about a structural experiment and stay away. He walked the north gallery with his folding rule extended. He measured the post spacing, the bay depth, the rafter angles, and the gap between the outer slabs and the top rail. He counted the cross-stacked courses and tested the corner cribs by pressing his weight against them. Then he walked to the northwest roof edge, the point where the gallery's sloping rafters met the end of the overhang, and pointed upward. The rafters were braced for downward load, snow weight. Almeda had calculated the dead load of wet snow at roughly 20 pounds per square foot and braced accordingly. Diagonal supports from the post to the midpoint of each rafter, preventing them from sagging. Amasa said she had braced for the weight that pushed down. She had not braced for the force that pulled up. In a strong gale, wind flowing over the roof slope would create suction on the leeward side, a lifting force that tried to peel the roof away from the posts. The steeper the slope, the greater the suction. The northwest corner, directly facing the prevailing wind, would experience the worst of it. Without upward bracing, tie-downs from the rafters to the posts, or from the posts to bury dead men, the first real storm could lift the entire northwest roof section like a hand opening a book. Almeda looked at the rafters. She looked at the braces she had installed. She looked at the gap in her design that Amasa had found in 30 seconds. She said he was right. Amasa said of course he was right. He said he had been building roofs for 30 years, and he knew what wind did to slopes that people braced in only one direction. He said it was the same mistake every new builder made, and it was the mistake that turned a shelter into a trap. Then Almeda asked whether he would help install the missing braces. Amasa's expression did not change. He folded his rule. He said he would help install wind bracing on the northwest roof section if, and only if, she abandoned the grass packing. Grass in a structure was fire waiting for a match. He would not lend his name or labor to a design that included several hundred bundles of dried fuel pressed against a building full of children. Almeda said the grass was what made the gallery work. Cordwood alone blocked the wind, but grass filled the gaps between the bays, insulated the sections where full stacking was impossible, and provided the continuous barrier that turned 4 separate windbreaks into a single shell. Without the grass, the gallery was a collection of wood piles with a roof over them. Amasa said that was a better description than she realized. The confrontation ended without resolution. Amasa left. The northwest roof remained unbraced against suction, and Almeda knew that his objection, like every objection Amasa raised, was legitimate enough to be dangerous precisely because it was not entirely wrong. She and Orson spent 2 days installing diagonal tie-downs from the rafters to the base of the posts, using rope and pegged connections that would resist upward pull. The bracing was not as strong as what Amasa could have built with his materials and his crew, but it was what they had. On October 25th, something happened that Almeda did not expect and could not have earned. Nell Brackett walked to the Weller claim carrying not beans or flour, but a question. She had found Rue that morning carrying bundles of cut grass from the prairie south of the settlement, each bundle as large as the child could manage, tied with twists of spare rope, the grass still green enough to need drying before it could be installed. Rue was carrying them one at a time, a quarter-mile each way. Nell did not comment on the design. She did not say she had changed her mind about the gallery's chances. She arrived the next morning with 4 women and 2 older children, each carrying binding cord and a hand sickle. Her condition was practical, not generous. She would personally inspect every grass bundle for dampness before it entered the gallery. Any bundle that felt soft, smelled sour, or failed to crackle when bent would be rejected and laid out for further drying. She had seen what wet hay did to a barn wall, and she was not interested in discovering what wet grass did to a cabin when the owner was asleep inside. In one day, the group cut, bound, and delivered 43 bundles. In 3 days, they had 112. Almeda did not call this a conversion. It was not. Nell still believed the gallery was more likely to rot or burn than to save anyone. But Nell also understood arithmetic, and the arithmetic said that a 9-year-old girl carrying grass bundles a quarter-mile at a time would not finish before spring, let alone before January. The grass arrived. The bays began to fill. And for the first time, the gallery started to look like something more than a skeleton of posts and a few stacked cords. Phase 3 began in early November. The roof, the outer skin, and the doors. Almeda installed the rafters herself, standing on a ladder Orson had built from pine poles and rope. Each rafter was a 12-foot timber, notched at both ends, one notch for the top rail near the cabin eave, one for the outer wall plate. She lifted them with a rope and pulley arrangement Orson designed, swinging each timber upward from the ground while Rue steadied the base. Her shoulders screamed with every lift. On the 3rd day of roofing, she could not raise her right arm above her head and had to switch to working left-handed. The work slowed. The calendar did not. Over the roof went pine slab decking, overlapping like shingles to shed water and snow. Over the outer walls went more slabs, nailed vertically with gaps at the bottom for drainage and slots near the top for ventilation. The ventilation was critical. Orson had insisted on it from the first revised drawing. Without high openings, warm, moist air escaping through the cabin's chinking would condense against the cold inner surface of the gallery wall, soaking the grass and creating the hidden dampness that could rot the structure from within. The entrance vestibule took 4 days. 2 doors, one outer, one inner, set at right angles so that neither door opened directly into the wind. The outer door faced south. The inner door faced east. To enter the cabin, a person walked through the outer door into the gallery passage, turned 90 degrees, and opened the inner door into the vestibule. The wind, following a straight path, struck the gallery wall and went nowhere. The chimney court was the simplest and most important bay. On the east wall, directly beside the stovepipe exit, Almeda left one bay completely empty. No cordwood, no grass, no lath screens, bare earth below, open air around the pipe, and a 4-foot gap between the nearest combustible material and the stove's exhaust. Orson measured the clearance 3 times. He made Almeda measure it a 4th time. A 12-foot strip of bare earth extended from the chimney court outward beyond the gallery wall. If sparks fell, they would land on dirt, not grass. Sloat's accusation that the gallery was a fire hazard had forced them to design the chimney clearance earlier and more carefully than they might have otherwise. The hostile skeptic had inadvertently improved the design he wanted to destroy. On November 2nd, the setback Almeda had been dreading arrived from the sky. A wet October snow, late enough to catch settlers by surprise, dumped 6 inches of heavy, soaking slush across Kettle Bend in 8 hours. The temperature hovered just below freezing, which meant the snow stuck to every surface, an added weight without the compensating lightness of dry powder. The northwest roof, not yet fully decked, caught the worst of it. Snow accumulated on the incomplete sheathing, pooled in the gaps between slabs and pressed downward with the dense heaviness of wet autumn snow. Two rafters bowed, one post, the replacement at the southwest corner, shifted nearly an inch as the footing softened beneath it. Almeda heard the wood complaining in the dark, a sound like a knuckle cracking, repeated at irregular intervals. She knew what it meant before she reached the gallery passage. She climbed the ladder in the dark with a shovel and began clearing snow from the northwest roof by hand. The slabs were slick. The snow was heavy. Each shovelful weighed 5 or 6 pounds, and there were hundreds of shovelfuls between her and a stable roof. Her fingers went numb in the first 20 minutes. She dropped the hammer twice when she tried to reinforce the bowed rafter with a diagonal brace. The second time, the hammer bounced off the rail and struck her left shin, and she sat on the ladder rung with both hands clamped around her leg, while the pain subsided enough to continue. Rue found blood on the hammer handle the next morning, not from the shin, from Almeda's right palm, where the old split between thumb and forefinger had reopened and bled onto the wood grip during the night. Almeda did not mention it. She was looking at the post that had shifted. Nearly an inch of lateral movement meant the top rail had separated from its notch. The bay beside it had a gap, and the rafter it carried was no longer seated properly. She spent the day jacking the post back into position using a lever made from a fence rail and a stone fulcrum, then tamping crushed stone around the base to stabilize the footing. Orson supervised from the ground because his lungs could not tolerate the effort of climbing. 2 days lost. The calendar read November 4th, 39 days until January 12th. Sloat struck again on November 7th. He filed a complaint with the Informal Claim Association, the loose group of settlers who adjudicated boundary disputes, shared road maintenance, and enforced the basic agreements that kept 13 families from tearing each other apart. His complaint stated that Almeda's structure was a public fire danger. He cited the volume of dried grass within the gallery, the proximity of the structure to the nearest neighboring claim, and the prevailing wind direction, which would carry sparks from a gallery fire toward the school and the eastern claims. The complaint was not frivolous. Grass fires had destroyed homesteads across Nebraska. A burning gallery sending embers downwind during a dry gale could threaten every building within a quarter mile. Sloat presented the complaint in person at Nell's store, where 3 claim holders and a massa were present. He offered, again, to purchase Almeda's land at a fair price and suggested that the Claim Association had the authority to order the removal of fire hazards. Almeda arrived while Sloat was still speaking. She did not interrupt. She waited until he finished, then asked Orson Bant, who had walked to the store that morning for tobacco, Sears, to answer the fire complaint. Orson did not defend the gallery. He forced Almeda to defend it herself, and he forced her to answer the legitimate part of the complaint rather than the malicious part. The legitimate concern was chimney proximity and ember reach. Almeda described the chimney court, the bare earth strip, and the separation between grass bays and the stovepipe. Orson then suggested 2 additional measures: widening the chimney court by another 2 feet and plowing a continuous 12-foot strip of bare earth around the entire outer perimeter of the gallery. Almeda agreed to both modifications immediately. They would cost her 2 more days of labor, but they would also remove the only factual basis for Sloat's complaint. Amasa listened to the entire exchange. He said nothing during the meeting. Afterward, he told Nell that the chimney court was properly designed, that the bare earth strip was standard practice around any structure containing hay or straw, and that Sloat's complaint was a nail looking for a board to sink into. He did not say the gallery would work. He said the fire objection had been answered. Sloat left the store without purchasing anything, which was the first time anyone could remember that happening. November bled into December. The temperature dropped 5 degrees, then 10. Morning ice thickened on the water bucket. The grass on the prairie turned brown and brittle, which was exactly what Almeda needed. Dry grass bundled easily and resisted moisture better than green. But it also meant the fire season would not fully end until the first permanent snow cover. Late November totals recorded in the ledger Almeda had begun keeping on wrapping paper. 8 3/4 cords stacked. The northwest, north, and most of the west wall stood at full depth, 4 to 6 feet of cross-stacked cordwood behind the outer slabs. The east wall was partially filled. The south wall, designated as the first consumption zone, held only 2 1/2 bays of half-depth wood. 168 dry grass bundles installed behind lath screens. The north and northwest sections were completely filled. The west and east sections had gaps. The south held the fewest bundles. 11 roof braces installed, including the wind suction tie-downs. The northwest corner held firm in every wind since the October snow. 1 gallery door hung. The second door, for the entrance vestibule, was still being fitted. It needed hinges Almeda could not afford, and she was carving wooden pivot pins as a substitute. $4.70 cash remaining. The gallery was not finished. The south wall was thin. The second door was missing. 2 east side bays had gaps. The bare earth strip needed another half day of plowing. But on a clear, bitter night in late November, Orson stood outside the gallery listening. From inside the pine draw, half a mile north, a sound came, a deep percussive report, like a gunshot fired inside a wooden box. Then another, several seconds later, standing timber cracking along old scars. The cold had found weaknesses in the heartwood and split them open. Orson came inside and told Almeda he no longer doubted her father's phrase. The cold was going to be severe, and it was going to be dry. Whether it reached 36 below zero or stopped at 20, the wind would carry it through every gap that had not been sealed. Almeda asked whether the gallery was ready. Orson said the gallery was as ready as they could make it. The question was whether everything they could make was enough. On December the 6th, Almeda hung the second gallery door. The vestibule was complete. The outer shell was closed enough to test, though 2 south side bays remained lightly filled, and the bare earth strip still needed widening in one section. Nell Brackett, whose store stocked the few manufactured goods available to Kettlebend, had obtained 2 match thermometers through a dry goods supplier in Long Pine. They were simple spirit column instruments, imprecise but consistent. Each read within a degree of the other when hung side by side, which was all the accuracy the test required. On December 10th, during an 8-degree night with steady northwest wind, Almeda and Nell conducted their experiment. 1 thermometer hung in the far corner of Almeda's cabin, the northeast corner, the farthest point from the stove, and the spot where cold accumulated first. The second thermometer hung in the equivalent corner of Amasa's cabin, a comparably sized log structure on the east ridge, chinked and sealed to Amasa's professional standards, but exposed to the wind on all sides. Each cabin began with a similar stove fire, a full charge of dry split wood loaded at the same hour. Wood additions were counted by stick rather than guessed. The women agreed on a standard size, each stick roughly the thickness of a man's forearm and the length of the stove box. 4 hours later, Nell read both thermometers. Almeda's far corner, 54 degrees. Amasa's far corner, 41. A difference of 13 degrees in the coldest part of each room. Almeda's stove had consumed 11 sticks. Amasa's stove had consumed 17. The gallery had not made Almeda's cabin warm. 54 degrees in the farthest corner meant the near stove temperature was perhaps 62, and the floor was colder than either reading. Everyone inside wore layers. Rue slept under 2 blankets, but Amasa's cabin, built by the best carpenter in the settlement, was 13 degrees colder in its worst corner and had burned 50% more fuel to get there. His professional walls, his tight joints, his proper construction, all of it open to the wind that Almeda's gallery had interrupted. Nell wrote the numbers in her ledger. She did not add commentary. Numbers, she had learned, spoke for themselves if given enough time. Orson refused to celebrate. The day after the test, he walked the gallery's inner passage. The 30-inch service corridor between the stacked bays and the cabin wall. He placed his bare hand against the inner surface of a grass-packed bay on the northwest section. His hand came away damp. Moisture. Warm air from inside the cabin, escaping through the chinking, had passed through the log wall and condensed against the cold inner surface of the grass screen. The grass itself was not wet, but the lath behind it was moist, and the air in the gap between grass and wall felt heavier than it should. He pointed at the damp spot and told Almeda that a wall which seemed warm could be rotting unseen. The grass was insulating the cabin from the wind, but the cabin was breathing moisture into the space the grass was supposed to keep dry. Without better ventilation above the damp zone, the grass would absorb enough moisture to lose its insulating value and begin decomposing, silently, invisibly, between the wall she could see and the wall she could not. They removed the wet bundle, recharged the chinking at the joint where the moisture was escaping, and added 2 additional ventilation slots above the highest grass screen in the affected bay. The fix took 3 hours. The lesson took longer to absorb. The gallery was not a finished structure. It was a system in continuous conversation with the weather, the stove, the cabin, and the air. Every improvement created a new boundary between warm and cold, and every boundary created a new place where moisture could gather and damage could hide. Amasa heard about the test results within 2 days. Everyone in Kettleben heard about them because Nell's ledger sat open on her counter, and she did not prevent anyone from reading it. Amasa's response was precise and, as always, technically grounded. He said the test proved only that Almeda had built an enormous wind fence around her cabin. He did not dispute the temperature difference. He disputed its meaning. A wind fence, he argued, would produce exactly the same result. A row of sawn boards or a solid stockade set 10 feet from the north wall would block the wind and reduce heat loss through the chinking without requiring 9 cords of fuel, 168 grass bundles, 22 posts, a second roof, and 6 months of labor by a woman, an old man, and a child. He was not wrong. A solid wind fence would have reduced the wind's impact on the north wall. But Nell, who had been adding numbers in her head while Amasa spoke, pointed out 3 differences. First, a wind fence protects 1 wall. The gallery protects 4. Second, a wind fence does not store fuel. The gallery is the fuel supply. It does not require additional storage. Third, a wind fence does not create a sheltered passage. The gallery allows movement around the cabin in conditions where open ground is lethal. Amasa said those were arguments in favor of complexity, and complexity failed in storms. Nell said the test numbers favored the complex structure over the simple one by 13 degrees and 6 sticks. Their exchange was the first time anyone in Kettleben had publicly argued in favor of the gallery on the basis of evidence rather than sympathy. Nell's conversion was not emotional, it was arithmetical, and arithmetic, in a settlement that measured its survival in cords and degrees, carried more authority than opinion. On January 11, 1888, the weather betrayed every expectation. The day turned mild. Strangely, unreasonably mild. Roof snow softened to slush by noon. Water dripped from eaves. Men worked outside without coats buttoned, and women opened doors to air out cabins that had been sealed since November. Children played on the road between the store and the school. A group of boys threw slush at each other. Two settlers rode to Long Pine for supplies they had been postponing. Sloat opened the mill shed and began cutting boards for a spring order. The warmth felt like mercy. It felt like the winter offering an apology for the weeks of bitter cold that had settled over the prairie since mid-December. Almeda did not trust it. She stood outside the gallery at noon and looked northwest. The sky above her was bright, the air almost balmy, but the horizon, low and distant, carried a color she had seen once before. Not gray, not blue. A bruised darkness that sat beneath the higher brightness like a stain spreading under clean cloth. She went to Orson's cabin. He was sitting on his step with his coat open, breathing more easily than he had in weeks. She asked him to look at the northwest sky. Orson looked. He did not need long. He said, "Tie ropes before the wind arrives." Afterward, she would not find the next door. Almeda returned to the claim and began closing every opening in the gallery. She secured the outer doors. She filled the stove. She carried extra water inside, 3 buckets rather than 1. She checked the chimney court and cleared ash from the stovepipe joint. She hung the guide rope that Orson had insisted on weeks earlier, a heavy cord running from the gallery's south door to a post beside Nell's store, roughly 140 yards away, anchored at waist height with knots every 10 paces. Rue asked why they were preparing for a storm when the sun was shining. Almeda said the sun was lying. The telegraph warning that had been issued for the region failed to reach Kettle Bend. The settlement had no telegraph office, no relay, and no way to receive the information that a massive cold front had formed in the Northern Territories and was descending across the plains at extraordinary speed. The same communication failure had been documented across hundreds of communities during the historical event. Warm morning conditions gave way to the storm without warning, trapping travelers, school children, and workers in the open. At approximately 12:45 in the afternoon on January 12, 1888, the wind reversed. It came from the northwest, and it did not build gradually. It struck. One moment the air was still and mild. The next, a wall of blown snow crossed the prairie, so thick and so fast that the store disappeared from view. Nell, standing in her doorway, watched the school vanish. Then the blacksmith shed. Then her own fence posts, 4 yards from where she stood. The temperature fell 30 degrees in less than 20 minutes. By the time a man could walk from the mill to the store, a distance of perhaps 200 yards, the air had turned from spring to killing cold, and the ground between the 2 buildings had become a featureless white void where direction did not exist. Several of Sloat's carpenters were still at the mill. 2 settlers were on the road to Long Pine. The school teacher had dismissed the children early because the morning was so warm and most had reached home, but not all. And the guide rope between Nell's store and the Weller gallery hummed in the gale like a plucked wire. The front hit Almeda's northwest wall first. The outer slabs vibrated in their nailing. A sound like rapid drumming traveled along the gallery's skin as the wind found every joint, every slot, every imperfect overlap in the pine cladding. The first diagonal brace groaned, a low wooden complaint that Almeda felt through the soles of her boots as much as she heard it. She stood in the gallery passage, her hand against the inner cabin wall. Through the logs and chinking, she could feel the faintest pulse of pressure. The wind arriving at the building not as a gale, but as a whisper, its force spent against the outer slabs, the cordwood, the grass, and the 7 feet of intervening air. Inside the cabin, The lamp flame leaned perhaps 2 degrees from vertical. In an unprotected cabin, it would have guttered or gone out. Almeda understood in that moment what the gallery was. It was not insulation. It was not a heater. It was not a second wall. It was a brake. It made the air slow. Everything else, the temperature difference, the fuel savings, the frost-free chinking, was a consequence of that single function. Stop the moving air, and the stove could do what stoves were designed to do: push heat into a space that could hold it. The wind outside reached speeds that bent the pine trees in the draw. Inside the gallery, the air moved. Inside the cabin, the air was still. In Amasa's cabin on the East Ridge, the story was different. Snow powdered through the window casing within the first hour. Fine white dust gathered on the sill, then the floor, then the table. The chinking between the logs, professionally applied, tightly packed, carefully maintained, contracted in the sudden cold and opened hairline fractures along every joint on the north and west walls. The stove drew hard, its draft sucking air through the chimney with the ferocity of a gale that was trying to pull the heat out through the roof as fast as the fire could produce it. Amasa fed the stove every 20 minutes. Each charge burned faster than the last as the cabin's interior temperature dropped and the fire fought harder to compensate. By mid-afternoon, the water bucket in the rear corner had begun to freeze around its rim. A thin, clear shell of ice formed on the surface and thickened while Amasa watched. He had built the cabin correctly: straight walls, tight joints, proper stove. The cabin was everything he believed a house should be, and the wind was going through it as though the walls were made of cloth. At Sloat's house, the largest in the settlement, framed with milled lumber and sided with boards from his own mill, an exposed gable on the northwest corner lost several boards in the first hour. The wind entered the wall cavity through the gap and began lifting the interior paper lining. The sound was wrong, a rhythmic thumping like something alive inside the wall. Sloat nailed a blanket over the opening and kept nailing as the blanket tore. Inside Almeda's gallery, the first serious failure came at approximately 3 o'clock. One northwest slab, the second from the corner at shoulder height, tore free from its nailing. The nail heads had pulled through the soft wood, and the slab swung outward into the gale and disappeared. The opening was roughly 14 inches wide and 4 feet tall. Through it, the wind entered the gallery. The effect was immediate. Pressure built inside the passage. The air that had been slow and scattered now had a channel, an inlet that allowed the full force of the gale to pour into the 7-foot buffer zone and press against the cabin wall with a fraction of its outdoor speed, but vastly more force than the gallery was designed to admit. The cordwood bays nearest the breach held firm. Cross-stacked and tied back, they resisted the pressure. But the grass-screened 2 bays south began to bow inward, and the lath creaked. Orson came into the passage with a lantern tied to a peg driven into a rafter. His ribs, bruised weeks earlier during a fall from the ladder, made every step a visible effort. He breathed in sharp, controlled bursts that sounded like a man counting between each intake. They could not repair the outer wall. The opening faced directly into the gale, and any attempt to reach the exterior surface would expose them to wind that was now blowing ice crystals horizontally at speeds that stripped skin. Instead, Almeda closed the interior bay shutters, hinged lath panels that Orson had insisted on during the design phase, installed between each bay to prevent pressure from traveling laterally through the gallery. With the shutters closed, the breached bay was isolated from its neighbors. The wind entered through the gap and struck the inner cabin wall, but it could not spread along the passage to weaken the adjacent sections. Then she roped a spare door, the old cabin door that Amasa had told her to replace months ago, across the breach from the inside. She braced it with two fence rails wedged between the door surface and the nearest post. The fit was imperfect. Wind screamed around the edges. But the pressure inside the gallery dropped from a howl to a moan, and the grass screens stopped bowing. While they worked, a roof brace above the breach cracked. Not broke, cracked. A sound like a green stick bending past its limit. The brace held, but the crack was visible in the lantern light running diagonally across the grain. Orson stepped backward from the crack, and his foot caught on the drainage log beneath the lowest wood course. He fell against the cordwood bay, and the impact drove his damaged ribs against the end of a protruding split. He did not cry out. He made a sound that was smaller than a cry, a tight, involuntary exhale that told Almeda he could not draw a full breath. She helped him back to the cabin. He sat in the chair beside the stove and pressed his arm against his side. His face was gray. Rue brought a cloth and pressed it against his ribs where the bruise was spreading beneath his shirt. Almeda looked at the lantern still hanging in the passage, at the jury-rig door braced against the breach, at the cracked brace overhead. She had built the gallery. She had defended it. The man who had taught her to build it could no longer stand. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. The store thermometer, a large instrument mounted on Nell's porch, had been readable at noon. By 4 o'clock, the mercury had dropped past 0. By 6, it passed 10 below. By the time full darkness settled over Kettleben, the column had descended to approximately 20 below 0, and the wind had not diminished. The fictional thermometer at Almeda's cabin, hung on the gallery's inner passage wall, protected from direct wind, eventually stopped near 36 below. The spirit column contracted to a thread and did not move. Inside the cabin, the numbers told a different story. Central room height, 4 feet above the floor, approximately 52 degrees. Near the floor, approximately 41. Along the north wall behind the undamaged gallery sections, 48. At the far northeast corner, the coldest point in the room, 44. In the gallery passage, below freezing, but largely calm. The air moved slowly through the outer slabs, wound through the cordwood, and arrived at the cabins chinking with so little remaining force that the feather test obey, which Almeda checked twice during the evening, showed only a gentle drift at the worst joints. The water bucket in the center of the cabin held liquid water. No ice rim, no surface skin. The temperature was cold enough to see breath, but warm enough to keep water from freezing. Frost appeared on one window edge where the glass was thinnest. Nowhere else. The room was not comfortable. Rue wore her coat. Almeda wore Josiah's coat over her own. Orson sat wrapped in a quilt with his arms pressed against his ribs. The stove consumed 1 stick every 12 minutes, but the cabin was habitable. In weather that was killing livestock in open pastures and freezing water in protected wells, the cabin was a place where a human body could function, move, think, and survive. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because the shelter has finally filled with people at the exact moment its fire begins to fail. The rope bell struck at approximately 8 o'clock. Orson had insisted on the bell. A tin cup filled with pebbles hung from the guide rope at the midpoint between the gallery and Nell's store. If someone pulled the rope hard enough, the cup rattled against its suspension wire and the sound carried through the gallery wall. The rattling was irregular, not a signal, a vibration caused by someone hauling on the line. Almeda opened the gallery's outer door and looked into nothing. The air was solid white. Snow traveled horizontally with such density that she could not see the guide rope beyond the first knot 10 paces away. She closed the door and told Rue to keep the stove fed. She told Orson to stay in the chair. Orson told her to take the rope and not to let go of it for any reason. If she fell and released the line, she would not find it again. The distance between life and death in this wind was less than the length of her arm. Almeda wrapped her right mitten around the guide rope and stepped into the storm. The cold hit her face like a physical blow. She could not breathe facing the wind. The air entered her lungs so cold that her chest constricted, and she had to turn her head sideways and draw breath through the scarf wrapped around her nose. The snow was not falling. It was flying. It struck her coat and stuck, building a crust of white across her chest and shoulders. She crawled rather than walked. On her knees, the wind passed over her, and the rope stayed at arm height. She counted knots. 1, 2, 3. At the 7th knot, she heard voices. Amasa Hoxie appeared on the rope first. He was carrying something beneath his coat, a shape pressed against his chest, wrapped in a blanket. Behind him, Nell Brackett clung to the rope with both hands, her head down, her skirt encased in driven snow. Behind Nell, Amasa's 17-year-old apprentice, Leif Corbin, staggered forward with one hand on the rope and one hand bare, his mitten lost somewhere between the store and here. Amasa's face was rigid. The shape beneath his coat was Nell's 6-year-old niece, whose breathing had been worsening all day and whose small body was now producing a wheeze audible above the wind. They reached the gallery. Almeda pulled them through the outer door, through the vestibule, and into the cabin, where the temperature difference hit them like stepping into summer. Amasa set the child on the bed. Nell collapsed against the wall. Leif stood swaying, his bare hand white and rigid, the fingers locked in the position they had held on the rope. One person was missing. Another carpenter from the mill crew had left Nell's store ahead of the others, but had not arrived at the gallery. Almeda went back out. She and Amasa roped themselves together, his suggestion, the first time he had deferred to the guide rope system he had once called unnecessary, and followed the line back toward the store. At the halfway point, they left the main rope and swept a looped secondary line in widening arcs toward the blacksmith shed, where the missing man might have sheltered. They found him collapsed against the shed wall. He was conscious, but unable to stand. His legs had stopped obeying him. His clothing was soaked with driven snow that had melted against his skin and refrozen. Amasa lifted the man's shoulders. Almeda looped the rope around his chest. They pulled him along the ground back to the main line and followed it to the gallery. He was alive when they brought him inside. He stopped speaking within minutes. 14 people now occupied the 16 by 20-foot cabin. Almeda, Rue, Orson, Amasa, and Leif. Nell and her niece. The collapsed carpenter. 3 women from neighboring claims who had reached the gallery before the storm reached full force. 2 children belonging to one of the women, and a boy of 14 who had been walking between the school and his family's cabin when the wind hit and had followed the guide rope without knowing where it led. The stove held the room near 50 degrees. But 14 bodies breathing in a sealed space produced moisture at a rate the cabin's ventilation could not handle. Within an hour, frost began forming on the inside of the window. The glass that had stayed clear for weeks now clouded with ice crystals as warm, damp air met the cold surface. Wet coats could not stay inside. The steam they produced in the heated room would accelerate the frost, overwhelm the ventilation, and create the same moisture problem Orson had warned about in the gallery, warm dampness condensing against cold surfaces. Almeda ordered every outer garment hung in the gallery passage, where the below-freezing temperature would keep them frozen rather than dripping. Leif's bare hand needed treatment. Amasa, who had seen frostbite in Iowa, wanted to place the hand beside the stove to warm it quickly. Almeda stopped him. She had watched her father treat a frostbitten logger in Maine. Rapid warming damaged the tissue worse than the cold itself. She placed Leif's hand in a basin of cool water, water from the bucket, not water heated on the stove, and kept it submerged while the sensation returned. Leif said nothing. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out along his neck. Rue gave her bed to Nell's niece. The child's breathing was labored but steady. Nell wrapped her in every dry blanket in the cabin and sat beside her through the night. The storm did not end at nightfall. It grew worse. By 10 o'clock, the wind had shifted several degrees north, striking the gallery from a new angle. The breached northwest bay, sealed with its jury-rigged door, held, but the pressure now concentrated on the north center bays, where the cordwood was deepest and the grass screens were fully packed. Almeda checked the passage every hour. Each inspection was a controlled exercise in fear. She opened the inner vestibule door, stepped into the below-freezing gallery, and walked the full perimeter with a lantern, checking each bay for signs of failure: bowed lath screens, shifted wood courses, cracked braces, moisture. At midnight, she found the problem she had been dreading. The storm was lasting longer than her initial fuel estimate. She had calculated stove consumption at roughly 1/3 cord per week in severe weather. But 14 people in a sealed cabin, with the stove running continuously at maximum draw, were burning wood faster than the weekly rate. The Southside bays, the designated first consumption zone, were already showing gaps where she had pulled fuel. She needed to remove wood from the east gallery without opening adjacent bays. Each bay she emptied thinned the windbreak on that side. The rules she had established with Nell's stones were clear. Consume from the sheltered side first, never open 2 adjacent bays during a storm, and replace every emptied section with whatever material was available. She pulled wood from the southeast bay, the most sheltered section, and sent Amasa to shift the empty lath screens outward, creating a thinner but continuous barrier. She stuffed the vacated inner zone with dry brush bundles that had been stored in the vestibule for kindling. The brush was loose and light, nothing like the tight-packed cordwood, but it was better than an empty gap. Amasa worked beside her without speaking. He moved the screens where she pointed. He stacked brush where she directed. He did not offer alternative designs. He did not suggest improvements. He worked under Almeida's command because, inside this structure, her authority was absolute. Not because she had claimed it, but because she was the only person who understood how the gallery functioned as a system. Somewhere during the midnight fuel rotation, he understood what he had dismissed. The gallery was not a woodpile wearing a roof. It was a machine with moving parts, consumption rates, failure modes, and operating rules that required knowledge to follow. Every bay was connected to every other bay. Every piece of fuel removed changed the structure's behavior. Every decision about where to burn and where to preserve was a decision about where the wind would win and where the cabin would hold. The gallery was a clock, just as Nell had said, but it was not winding down passively. It was being operated. The collapsed carpenter began breathing irregularly at approximately 2 in the morning. His breaths came in short, uneven bursts, separated by pauses that lengthened each time. Orson, who had seen hypothermia in men pulled from rivers, directed treatment from his chair. Keep the man horizontal. Keep him wrapped. Do not warm him quickly. Keep his feet elevated. Amasa lifted the carpenter's legs while one of the neighbor women held his head. The man's name was Torsten Haugen. He was 34, unmarried, and had come from a small farm near Rushville to work at Sloat's mill. He had tried to reach his rented room behind the blacksmith shed because he kept his wages hidden beneath the floorboard, and in the confusion of the storm's arrival, He had calculated the distance as shorter than it was. By the time he reached the shed wall, he could not remember which direction he had come from or which direction the road lay. He survived the night. His breathing steadied before dawn, and by morning he could speak slowly, with long pauses between words, as though the cold had frozen not just his body, but the connections between his thoughts. He would lose sensation permanently in 2 fingers of his left hand, but he would keep the hand, and he would keep his life. Elsewhere in Kettlebend, the storm killed. An isolated settler on a claim east of the road, a man who had occupied his land for less than 3 months and had built a frame house from Sloat's lumber, was found dead after the storm in an outbuilding 60 feet from his cabin door. He had gone out to check on a sick cow and had not found his way back. 60 feet. The distance between his door and the building where he died was shorter than the guide rope between Almeda's gallery and Nell's store. Before dawn, the last crisis struck. The northwest roof, which had survived 14 hours of continuous gale, sagged beneath a hard drift of compacted snow. The wind had driven snow against the gallery's north face and packed it into a dense layer that accumulated on the sloping roof rather than sliding off. The weight built through the night, invisible in the darkness, pressing down on rafters that had already been weakened by the October snow incident and the cracked brace above the breached bay. Everyone in the cabin heard the post split. Not crack, split. A sound like a green log thrown into a hot fire. A sharp, explosive report that came from the northwest corner and traveled through the gallery's frame into the cabin wall. Amasa said the roof was coming down. Almeda remembered Orson's lesson. Not the specific words, the principle. A failing structure does not need more support at the point of failure. It needs load transferred away from the failure point to sound members on either side. The cabin's long table, a 6-foot pine slab on trestle legs that Josiah had built the first winter, was the strongest piece of furniture in the room. Almeda and Amasa tipped it vertical, carried it into the gallery, and wedged it beneath the main rail at the point where the split post was no longer carrying its share. They drove split wood between the table's edge and the rail until the fit was tight enough that the table could not shift. The improvised prop transferred the roof load from the split post to the table legs, which stood on the gallery's stone pad foundation. The post still leaned. The crack was visible in the lantern light, but the rail above it no longer sagged. Then Almeda sent every adult who could stand into the gallery to shovel snow from the protected roof edge through access panels that Orson had insisted on during Phase 3. Small hinged openings in the roof decking that allowed snow removal without climbing onto the exterior surface. 5 people shoveling in below freezing air, passing snow through panels into the gallery passage, where it piled against the outer wall and would melt when the storm ended. The work took 2 hours. Almeda's hands bled. Amasa's back locked. One of the neighbor women wept from the cold and kept shoveling. When they finished, the roof sat level. The split post leaned against its brace but held. The table stood vertical beneath the rail, solid as a pillar. The wind fell near dawn on January 13th. It did not stop gradually. It withdrew, as though the storm had spent what it intended to spend and had no further use for Kettlebend. The silence was enormous. After 14 hours of continuous howling, the absence of wind felt like a physical substance, a weight in the air that pressed against the eardrums and made the small sounds of the cabin impossibly loud. The stove ticking, a child breathing, water dripping from a coat hung in the passage. Almeda opened the gallery's south door. The world outside was white, still, and brutally cold. The thermometer in the passage still read below 30. The air burned her lungs. Frost hung in the atmosphere like dust. But the light was clear, the sky was blue, the storm was finished. She walked to the cabin and looked at the water bucket on the table. The bucket had sat in the center of the room for 14 hours through the worst blizzard in the settlement's brief history. She dipped the ladle. The water was liquid, cold, perfectly still, but liquid. No ice rim, no frozen surface, no crystals forming around the edges. In cabins across Kettlebend, the frame houses, the exposed log buildings, the structures Amasa had built with straight walls and tight joints, buckets were frozen solid. Stove ash was cold. Blown snow covered interior floors. Trim had separated from frames. Chinking lay in pieces on the ground. Amasa Hoxie stood beside the cabin wall in the gallery passage. The lamp flame, still burning from the night before, leaned no more than a degree from vertical. He did not speak. He placed his hand against the logs where the wind had not reached. The wall was dry. The chinking was intact. The temperature inside was cold but survivable, and the 14 people who had crowded into this 16 by 20 room were all still breathing. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked out through the vestibule, through the gallery's south door, and looked back at the structure he had called a woodpile wearing a roof. It stood. Damaged. One split post, one breached bay, a cracked brace, 3 damp grass bundles. But it stood, and inside it, the water had stayed liquid. The morning after the storm, Almeda did not allow anyone to celebrate. She told Nell to keep the children inside. She told Amasa to stay off the roof. She told the neighbor women to heat water and feed the stove. Then she walked the gallery alone, bay by bay, starting at the south door and moving clockwise through the passage with Orson's lantern held at knee height, chest height, and overhead at each section. She carried a stub of pencil and a strip of wrapping paper torn from a flour sack. She wrote down every failure she found, and she found them before she allowed herself to count what it held. One split post, the northwest corner, cracked vertically along its full length, held in position only by the table prop and the braces on either side. Load-bearing capacity gone. Replacement required before the next storm. 2 damaged braces. The diagonal tie-down above the breached bay cracked across the grain, and a secondary brace on the north center section where the wind shift had concentrated pressure during the night. Both functional but weakened. One breached outer bay, the northwest slab that had torn free, now sealed with the jury-rigged door. The door held but was not weather-tight. Ice had formed around its edges where driven snow had melted and refrozen. 3 damp grass bundles, the 2 adjacent to the moisture joint Orson had identified in December, and 1 new bundle on the northeast section, where condensation had accumulated during the night of 14 bodies breathing in a sealed room. No fire damage. The chimney court had performed exactly as designed. Sparks from the overtaxed stove had landed on bare earth and died. The 12-foot fire strip showed no scorch marks, no major inner wall frost. The chinking on 3 joints showed hairline frost feathering, but the mud had held. On the exposed sections, the south wall where the gallery was thinnest, frost penetration was visible but minor. Fuel consumed during the crisis, roughly 1/3 cord. Approximately 7 1/2 cords remained in the gallery. Almeda recorded every number. Then she folded the paper, put it in her apron pocket, and walked back to the cabin, where 14 people were waiting for her to tell them what had happened. She said the gallery had held. She said it had sustained damage that needed repair before the next severe weather. She did not say it had performed well. She did not say she was proud. She said the posts needed replacing, the braces needed reinforcing, and 3 grass bundles needed to come out before they rotted. Orson, still seated in his chair, with his arm pressed against his ribs, watched her deliver the inventory of failures and said nothing. When she finished, he nodded once. He had taught her to inspect damage before she inspected success, and she had done it without being reminded. Nell Brackett performed her own inspection that afternoon. She did not walk the gallery. She walked to her store, opened the rear room where she stored surplus goods, and looked at the water bucket she had left beside the back wall. The bucket was frozen solid. The ice had expanded and cracked the wooden staves apart. Water, now a column of gray ice, stood upright where the bucket had split around it. Nell carried the frozen bucket to the Weller claim and set it on the table beside Almeda's bucket, which still held liquid water. She did not make a speech. She opened her ledger to the page where she had recorded the December temperature test and added a new entry: the date, the approximate low temperature, the duration of the storm, and 2 words in the column she had labeled result. Almeda's cabin, liquid. Nell's store, solid. She left the ledger open on the table where everyone could see it and went to heat water for Torsten Haugen, who was sitting upright but could not grip a cup. Amasa Hoxie's conversion did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived in pieces over the course of 3 days, and it began not with a confession, but with a walk. On the afternoon of January the 14th, 2 days after the storm, Amasa gathered 6 settlers beside the damaged Northwest Bay. He had asked them to come. He had not told them why. The bay was open. The jury rig door had been removed, and the torn slab had not been replaced. Through the gap, the settlers could see the cabins on the East Ridge, Amasa's cabin among them, with blown snow piled against their walls, chinking, crumbled trim separated from frames, and ice coating the interior window glass. Amasa stood in the gap and pointed at his own cabin. Then he turned and placed his hand against the inner wall of Almeda's gallery, the cabin logs behind the undamaged bays. The wall was dry. The chinking was intact. The temperature in the passage was cold but calm. He said, "I said a house needed walls, not a woodpile wearing a roof." He let the words sit. No one laughed. No one spoke. Then he said, "I built walls for what falls from the sky. She built for what moves sideways." His hand stayed on the wall. He pressed it there, as though testing something he had refused to believe until he could feel it against his palm. The admission was not an apology. Amasa did not apologize because he had not been wrong about construction. He had been wrong about the problem. He had built for snow load, for water penetration, for the static weight of winter pressing down. Almeda had built for the dynamic force of winter pressing sideways. The wind that carried cold through every joint his craftsmanship could not fully seal. His admission validated the principle without pretending that every part of Almeda's design was perfect. The split post was a failure. The breached bay was a failure. The damp grass bundles were a failure. But the principle, stop the moving air before asking the stove to fight the temperature, had held through the worst night the settlement had ever experienced. Amasa did not offer to help rebuild the damaged sections. He went back to his own cabin and began repairing his own chinking. But when Almeda saw him working that evening, she noticed that he had moved his woodpile from the south side of the cabin to the north. Within a week, 6 families had come to Almeda with questions, not requests. Questions. Specific, practical questions from people who had spent the storm in cabins where the water froze, the chinking failed, and the stove could not keep pace with the wind. A man whose frame house on the East Ridge had lost interior temperature so fast that his children slept in their coats for 3 nights asked how deep the wood needed to be stacked against his north wall. A woman whose cabin sat on exposed ground near the road asked whether grass bundles alone, without cordwood, would provide any benefit on a west-facing wall. A couple who had lost their entire winter fuel supply because their woodpile, stored in an open shed 30 yards from the cabin, had been buried under a drift so deep they could not reach it for 4 days, asked how to integrate storage with protection so that the fuel was accessible during a storm rather than imprisoned by one. Almeda answered each question separately because each cabin sat on different ground, faced a different direction, and had different weaknesses. She refused to reproduce the entire gallery. Most homes did not need 7-foot galleries. Most families did not have 9 cords to stack. Most situations called for targeted protection, not a continuous shell. She told them to start with the same thing she had started with, a feather. Hold a feather beside every joint on the north and west walls during a windy night. Mark the joints where the feather moves. Those are the points where the wind is entering. Everything else, the wood screens, the grass packing, the vestibules, the guide ropes, follows from knowing where the air comes in. She taught them to re-chink active leaks with fresh lime mortar and oakum, pressing the material deep into the joint rather than smearing it across the surface. She taught them to build cribbed wood windbreaks, smaller versions of her gallery bays, 4 feet deep and 6 feet high, positioned against the walls where the feather test showed the worst infiltration. She taught them to leave safe chimney zones, to maintain bare earth fire strips, and to design removable grass screens that could be inspected for moisture and replaced when they deteriorated. She taught them the consumption rule: burn from the sheltered side first, never open 2 adjacent sections during a storm, and replace every emptied bay with whatever material was available. She taught them to tie guide ropes between every building that someone might need to reach during a whiteout, and she taught them for free. No charge, no trade, no obligation. Nell asked why. Almeda said that if Sloat could not sell the knowledge, he could not control who used it. Sloat's reaction to the storm was immediate and predictable. On January the 16th, 4 days after the blizzard, he called a meeting at the store. He stood before 9 settlers and announced that the survival of the people in Almeda's cabin had resulted from the number of bodies present, not from the design of the structure. 14 people in a sealed room would produce enough body heat to keep the temperature above freezing, regardless of what surrounded the building. The gallery, he said, was incidental. Almeda was not present. She was replacing the split post. Nell was present. She waited until Sloat had finished and then produced 2 documents. The first was the December fuel comparison, the night when Almeda's cabin held 54 degrees in the far corner, while Amasa's held 41, with only 2 people in each cabin and no crowd of bodies to supplement the stove. The second was the storm ledger, the record Nell had kept during the night of January 12th, showing stove consumption, approximate temperatures at 2-hour intervals, and the condition of the water bucket. Sloat examined both documents. He could not dispute the December numbers because Nell's reputation for accuracy was the foundation of every transaction in the settlement. He could not dispute the storm ledger because 3 other people had watched Nell make the entries in real time. He shifted his attack. He could not disprove the method, so he attacked the ownership. He argued that Almeda had used slab wood taken from his discarded mill pile, offcuts that were his property, even after he had ordered them burned. The gallery, he claimed, contained stolen material. Nell pointed out that Almeda had purchased the slab wood she used before Sloat ordered the burning, and that the receipt of fire, recorded in Nell's ledger, naturally, predated the fire by 11 days. Sloat left the store without responding. He did not purchase anything on his way out. The weeks following the storm were not a celebration. They were a reckoning. The settler who had died in the outbuilding, 60 feet from his own door, was buried when the ground thawed enough to dig. His cabin, built from Sloat's lumber with Sloat's nails, had straight walls and tight joints. It had no windbreak, no vestibule, no guide rope, and no way for a man caught outside in a whiteout to find his way back to a door he could not see. The school teacher found ice inside the schoolhouse when she returned after the storm. Snow had entered through the window casings and covered the floor in a sheet of white. The stove had gone cold because no one had been present to feed it, and the books on the lowest shelf were frozen into a solid block. 3 families had lost livestock. 2 had lost stored food to freezing. 1 had lost a section of roof. Amasa compiled the damage reports because that was the kind of work Amasa did. Systematic, thorough, unsentimental. His list confirmed what the storm had already proven. The exposed structures failed in proportion to their exposure. Cabins on the West Ridge, facing the prevailing wind, had suffered the worst damage. Cabins with wood piles stored on the windward side had performed marginally better. Cabins in the lee of terrain features had held their temperatures longer, and one cabin, surrounded by a 7-foot gallery of cord wood and dried grass, had kept its water liquid and its 14 occupants alive. Amasa did not editorialize in his report. He listed the facts and left the conclusions to anyone who cared to draw them. In the last week of January, Orson Vickery sat in Almeda's cabin with his arms still pressed against his side and reviewed the gallery's damage with the precision of a man who had spent 4 decades studying the ways buildings failed. His ribs were healing slowly. The bruise had faded from purple to yellow, but deep breathing still cost him, and he could not lift weight above his waist without the muscles along his left side seizing. He asked Almeda to describe each failure point in sequence: the slab that tore free, the brace that cracked, the post that split, the grass bundles that absorbed moisture. Almeda described them. She had recorded each one on her wrapping paper inventory, and she had already begun formulating repairs. Orson listened, then asked the question he had been holding for 2 weeks. Which failure was the design's fault, and which was the builder's? Almeda did not answer immediately. She walked to the northwest bay, the breach section, and put her hand on the post beside the gap where the slab had torn free. The slab had failed because the nails were too short. She had used the nails she could afford, common cut nails, 1 3/4 inches long. Because longer nails cost more, and Sloat's pricing had forced her into the smallest available stock. The nails had held through ordinary wind. The gale's suction had pulled the slab past the nail's grip. The post had failed because the wood was sound, but the diameter was narrow, barely 6 inches where the split occurred. She had used a thinner post at that position because the larger timber she had felled was too heavy for the mare to haul in a single piece, and cutting it shorter would have left it below the minimum height. The grass bundles had failed because the chinking behind them was imperfect. The moisture came from inside the cabin, not from outside. The gallery had stopped the external wind, but the internal air, warm, damp, carrying the exhalations and cooking moisture of a crowded room, had escaped through joints she had not sealed well enough. Every failure traced back to a specific decision made under the pressure of time, money, or physical limitation. None of the failures were inherent to the principle. They were inherent to the conditions under which the principle had been applied. Orson nodded. He said the distinction mattered because the next version of the gallery, whoever built it, wherever they built it, would need to solve the builder's problems without abandoning the design's logic. Their collaboration shifted in that conversation. Orson no longer issued instructions first. He asked what Almeda saw. He asked what she would change. He asked how she would solve the nail problem, the post problem, the moisture problem. And he listened to her answers the way a teacher listens when the student has begun to see things the teacher has not. Almeda said the nail problem required longer fasteners or a different attachment method, peg joints rather than nailed joints at the highest stress positions. The post problem required either larger timber or doubled posts at corners. The moisture problem required better chinking on the inner wall and wider ventilation gaps above the grass screens. Orson said all 3 answers were correct and asked one more question. What new failure would each solution create? Almeda paused. Then she described, without prompting, how pegged joints would be stronger but harder to disassemble when bays needed clearing, how doubled posts would carry more load but create wider gaps at the bay junctions, how wider ventilation gaps would reduce moisture but admit more cold air into the passage. Every improvement created a new way to fail. The gallery was not a problem to be solved. It was a system to be understood. Orson smiled. It was the first time Almeda had seen him smile since the storm. It was not a warm smile or a proud smile. It was the smile of a man who had just confirmed something he had suspected, that the knowledge he had spent 40 years accumulating had found a place to survive after he was gone. Through February and into March, Almeda organized the improvements. She did not rush them. The worst of winter was past, and the urgency that had driven her from August through January gave way to a different kind of discipline, the patience to redesign rather than simply repair. Over spring and summer of 1888, the gallery was rebuilt section by section while the cabin remained occupied and protected. Almeda and Orson drew revised plans on Nell's wrapping paper, argued over measurements, and tested changes one bay at a time. The improvements accumulated shorter modular bays, 3 feet wide instead of the original 5 and 6, allowing individual sections to be removed, inspected, and rebuilt without disturbing adjacent bays. Removable diagonal braces, pegged rather than nailed so that braces could be extracted for roof clearing and replaced without splitting the connection point. Stone pads beneath every wood crib, flat river stones set in compacted earth, lifting the lowest course 4 inches off the ground and providing a drainage path that kept the foundation dry even during spring thaw. Larger high vents, screened openings near the ridge of the gallery roof, wide enough to exhaust damp air, but angled to prevent driven snow from entering during a gale. A detached chimney chase. The stovepipe now exited the cabin wall, crossed the gallery passage through a clay-lined metal sleeve, and rose through its own independent flue mounted on the gallery's outer wall. The chimney court remained empty, but the pipe no longer passed through the interior of the gallery at all. Hinged storm shutters between the cabin wall and the gallery, operable from inside the cabin, allowing Almeda to seal the inner passage during severe weather without entering the gallery. Roof access doors for clearing drifts, the same panels she had used during the storm, now larger, hinged with proper hardware, and positioned at the 4 points where snow accumulation was heaviest. Separate grass modules, self-contained bundles in lightweight wooden frames that could be slid in and out of the bays like drawers, inspected for moisture, dried in the sun, and returned. No grass touched the cabin wall directly. A permanent 12-foot bare earth fire strip, plowed, raked, and maintained around the entire outer perimeter. Almeda marked it with stones every 4 feet so that it could be reestablished after snow cover melted. The improved gallery needed only 5 to 7 cords of strategically placed fuel rather than 9 cords around every side. The thickest packing remained on the northwest, where the prevailing wind hit hardest. The thinnest remained on the south, where the wind was weakest and fuel consumption began first. The system was the same. The execution was better. In April, Almeda taught Amasa to use the feather test. He arrived at the Weller claim carrying his folding rule and his professional skepticism. He had been rechinking his own cabin since January, using techniques he had learned in Iowa, the standard methods he had always used, and the results were satisfactory, but not complete. Drafts persisted at 3 joints on the north wall where the logs had warped during the freeze-thaw cycle. Almeda handed him a goose feather and told him to hold it beside each joint. Amasa held the feather with the gravity of a man performing a task he considered beneath his skill. The feather fluttered at the first joint. He moved to the second. Flutter. Third. Still. He asked why the third joint did not leak when the other 2 did. Almeda said the third joint was sheltered behind the gallery bay that he had helped fill during the storm. Amasa looked at the feather. He looked at the wall. He looked at the gallery. Then he folded his rule, put it in his vest pocket, and asked Almeda to show him the correct technique for packing grass screens. He did not acknowledge that the feather test was useful. He criticized the feather's quality. Too soft. The barbs were not aligned. A proper test required a stiffer quill. But he performed the test on every joint in his cabin that evening, and when Nell asked him the following morning how his rechinking had gone, he said he had found 3 leaks he would have missed without the feather. He did not mention Almeda by name. He did not need to. Nell recorded the conversation in her ledger. Nell herself had begun teaching. She showed families how to weigh and inspect grass bundles for moisture, a technique she had developed during the October bundling campaign and refined through the winter. A dry bundle of the correct size weighed roughly 4 pounds. A damp bundle weighed 6 or more. She taught the women to squeeze each bundle at its center and listen for the crackle of fully dried stems. A soft, silent squeeze meant moisture. Moisture meant rot. Rot meant failure. Amasa, in turn, taught roof joinery. He held Saturday sessions at the school, showing settlers how to notch rafters, brace ridgepoles, and install the diagonal tie-downs that prevented wind suction from peeling a roof. He taught it as his own knowledge, which it was. But he taught it in the context of protecting galleries and windbreaks, which was Almeda's context. The knowledge became communal. No single person owned all of it. Almeda understood wind and air movement. Orson understood structure and failure modes. Amasa understood joinery and load distribution. Nell understood measurement, record keeping, and the arithmetic of fuel consumption. Each person taught what they knew, and the settlement grew stronger at the joints where their knowledge overlapped. On a cool evening in late May, Orson took Almeda to the bare earth strip around the gallery. He walked slowly. His lungs had not improved since January, and the warm spring air, which should have eased his breathing, seemed to make no difference. He stopped twice on the 40-foot walk from the cabin door to the outer perimeter. At the edge of the bare earth strip, he bent down, carefully, protecting his ribs, and dropped a burning twist of dried grass onto the plowed ground. The flame ate the twist and died. The bare earth gave it nothing to consume. Then he walked 4 paces past the strip and dropped a second twist onto the standing prairie grass. The flame ran. It traveled 3 feet in 2 seconds, caught a dry stem, jumped to the next, and spread in a widening arc that Almeda stamped out with her boot before it reached a 4th stem. Orson said, "Every shelter improvement creates a new way to fail." The gallery stopped wind. The gallery also stored 9 cords of dry wood and 168 bundles of dry grass, within reach of any spark that traveled far enough. A structure designed to survive the coldest night of winter was also a structure designed to burn on the driest day of summer. The bare earth strip was not decoration. It was the boundary between the 2 modes of failure, cold and fire, that the gallery had to survive simultaneously. Almeda already knew this. She had known it since Sloat's fire complaint. But hearing Orson say it, watching him demonstrate it with 2 twists of grass and 40 years of experience, made the knowledge feel different. It felt final. It felt like a lesson being completed. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at Nell's store from Orson's daughter in Omaha. His lungs were worsening. She had found a room for him near a doctor. She asked him to come before winter returned. Orson gave Almeda his plumb bob. It was a simple brass weight on a string, worn smooth by decades of use, its point scratched and reground more times than either of them could count. He kept his carpenters square. He said, "You know how to find straight. Keep learning how things burn." He left by rail from Long Pine in the first week of June. Almeda rode the mare to the station and waited until the train was out of sight. She did not weep on the platform. She wept on the ride home, alone on the road, where the sound was lost in the wind. Back at the claim, she hung the plumb bob on a nail beside the north wall, the wall where the feather had first told her what the wind was doing. The brass weight turned slowly in the draft that still crept through the old chinking. It pointed straight down, indifferent to the air that moved around it. She had the plumb line. She did not have the man who had taught her to use it. Everything that came next, she would build without him. September of 1888 brought the test she was not expecting. The summer had been dry. August rain fell twice, barely enough to green the surface before the sun burned it off. The prairie grass grew tall, dried early, and stood in brittle waves across every acre between Kettleben and the Niobrara breaks. On the 14th of September, sparks from Sloat's mill engine, a wood-fired boiler that powered the circular saw, caught the dry grass west of the settlement. The fire started small and grew fast. By the time the first shout reached the road, a line of flame 80 yards wide was advancing toward the settlement at the speed of a walking horse. The wind was from the west. The fire would reach the wood galleries first. Sloat stood on his mill porch and watched the fire he had accidentally started advance toward the structures he had spent a year trying to destroy. His accusation that the galleries were fire traps was about to be tested by his own carelessness. Almeda took command. She did not ask for authority. She took it because she was the only person in Kettlebend who understood both the galleries' vulnerability to fire and their utility as emergency infrastructure. She issued orders in the sequence Orson had taught her: assess the threat, protect what matters, sacrifice what does not. First, remove all grass cartridges from the western galleries. The modular frames slid out in seconds. Women and children pulled bundles from the exposed bays and stacked them on the bare earth strip east of the buildings where the fire could not reach them. The cordwood stayed. It would not ignite from radiant heat unless flame reached it directly, and removing it would take hours they did not have. Second, close all inner shutters between the cabins and the gallery passages. If fire entered the gallery, the shutters would prevent it from reaching the cabin walls. Third, plow and scrape wider fire breaks. Every adult with a shovel or a plow blade worked the strips between the approaching fire and the nearest structure. The bare earth perimeters Almeda had maintained since January served as the starting lines. The plowing extended them outward to create gaps wide enough that flame could not jump. Fourth, dismantle one connecting wood bay between the gallery of the nearest cabin and the gallery of the next. Fire traveled through continuous fuel, break the continuity, and the fire had to cross open ground to reach the next building. Fifth, use the gallery passages to move water and tools around the protected homes. The passages, calm, sheltered, connected, functioned as covered corridors through which people could carry buckets, shovels, and wet hides without crossing open ground where sparks were falling. Sixth, position wet hides at gallery doorways. Not to extinguish fire, a hide could not stop a grass fire, but to catch airborne embers before they entered the passage and reached the cordwood. Seventh, and this was the decision that defined Almeda's independence from Orson. She refused to waste water wetting the roofs. The gallery roofs were pine slabs, green enough that surface wetting would evaporate before the fire arrived. Every bucket of water thrown onto a roof was a bucket that could not be used to soak the ground at the fire's edge, where it would actually slow the advance. The fire reached Sloat's uncleared lumberyard first. His stacked boards, darpros, sawn pine, dry, arranged in rows for seasoning, created a continuous fuel path from the western prairie directly to his mill. The fire entered the yard, climbed the first stack, and spread from board to board with a sound like sustained applause. Sloat called for help saving the lumber. Almeda looked at the lumber yard, looked at the fire's path, and made a calculation that Orson would have recognized. The lumberyard was lost. Attempting to save it would consume the water, labor, and time needed to protect the school and the occupied homes east of the yard. Every minute spent fighting the burning lumber was a minute not spent breaking the grass path between the yard and the settlement. She redirected the effort. Every available person moved east of the lumberyard and began cutting a fire break in the grass between the yard's burning edge and the nearest building, the school. Sloat screamed at her. He called her names that Nell later struck from the record. He said she was letting his livelihood burn to save her coffin houses. Almeda did not answer him. She was shoveling. The fire break held. The grass between the lumberyard and the school burned to the edge of the scraped earth and stopped. Embers crossed the gap and landed on the school's gallery windbreak. Amasa's two-sided wood screen, installed in March, and smoldered against green pine slabs that did not catch. One ember landed on a grass bundle that had been left in a bay by mistake. A 14-year-old boy pulled the bundle out and stamped it flat. The lumberyard burned for 2 hours. 3/4 of Sloat's seasoned stock was destroyed. The mill building survived because its stone foundation and metal roof did not burn, but the inventory was gone. Not one occupied home was damaged. Not one gallery ignited. Not one person was injured. If this story reminds you that preparation means studying how your own solution can fail, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The fire resolved 2 questions and opened a third. The first question, whether the galleries could survive a fire, had been answered. They could. If the grass was removable, the fire breaks were maintained, and someone understood that water belonged on the ground, not on the roof. The second question, whether Almeda could lead without Orson, had been answered. She had taken command of a community emergency, made decisions under pressure, sacrificed property to save lives, and applied the principles Orson had taught her in a situation he had never anticipated. The bare earth strip, the modular grass cartridges, the inner shutters, the dismantled connecting bay. Every tool she used had been designed for winter, and every one of them worked in fire because the underlying logic, separate what burns from what must survive, was the same in both crises. The third question was Sloat's. For 3 days after the fire, Sloat said nothing to Almeda. He supervised the clearing of his burned lumberyard. He calculated his losses. He sent a message to a supplier in Omaha requesting replacement stock on credit. On the 4th day, Amasa confronted him at the store. Amasa said that Sloat had maintained no fire break around his lumberyard. Amasa said that the mill engine spark arrestor had been documented as defective since July. Amasa said that the fire had started on Sloat's property, traveled through Sloat's fuel, and been stopped by the techniques Sloat had spent a year dismissing. Sloat said Almeda had abandoned his lumber to burn. Amasa said Sloat had abandoned his own fire break. The exchange was public. Nell recorded it. The settlement heard every word. Sloat's authority, built on credit, materials, and the presumption that modern methods required his products, cracked along a fault line that the fire had exposed. He had sold the buildings, but not maintained the ground around them. He had provided the fuel, but not the protection. The man who had called the galleries fire hazards had started the fire that proved they were not. 5 days after the fire, Sloat sent word through Nell that he wanted Almeda to inspect his rebuilt mill shed. The message was not an invitation, it was a request. The distinction mattered because Sloat had never requested anything from Almeda. He had offered, demanded, threatened, and bargained, but he had never asked. Almeda agreed to inspect the shed on one condition. The construction lessons she had been teaching at the schoolhouse on Sundays would remain public and free, and Sloat would not charge for advice derived from principles the settlement had developed communally. Sloat agreed. He had no leverage to refuse. Almeda inspected the shed the following morning. She walked its perimeter, checked the stovepipe clearance, examined the fire breaks, and suggested 3 modifications: a wider bare earth strip on the west side, a ventilation gap beneath the stored lumber to prevent ground moisture from reaching the lowest boards, and a screened spark arrestor on the engine exhaust. She did not charge for the advice. She did not gloat. She did not mention the burned lumberyard. Sloat listened, made notes on a scrap of wood with a carpenter's pencil, and said nothing beyond confirming the measurements. He had not admitted wrongdoing. He had not surrendered control. But he had stood in his own mill yard and asked a woman he had tried to ruin for help protecting the property he had left. The winter of 1888 had answered the question of whether one woman could survive by stopping the wind. The winter of 1889 would answer a different question: whether a settlement could learn to stop the wind together. Almeda and Nell formed the Kettleben Wintering Circle in October of 1888. It was not a company. It was not a patent venture. It was a handshake between 2 women at Nell's counter, witnessed by the ledger that had recorded every number since August of the previous year. The agreement was simple. Families would contribute labor to one another's wind protection before the first snow. Each household would submit its own fuel measurement: cords stacked, bays filled, grass bundles inspected, to Nell's ledger. Storm observations would be shared. Construction lessons would remain public. No family would be refused help because of inability to pay. Nell's contribution was the system. She designed inspection sheets, 1 page per household, listing the items Almeda had taught: feather test results for each wall, number of rechinking repairs, depth of windbreak bays, condition of grass screens, chimney clearance distance, guide rope connections, and fuel consumption projections based on the previous winter's burn rate. Every sheet was dated and filed. Every entry was written in Nell's careful hand. Almeda's contribution was the knowledge. She walked every claim in Kettleben during October and November, performing feather tests, marking problem joints, and recommending windbreak configurations tailored to each cabin's exposure, fuel supply, and labor capacity. Not every cabin needed a gallery. Most did not. Almeda's original 7-foot continuous shell had been an emergency response to an uninhabitable cabin with no money for conventional repair. It was the answer to her problem, not a universal prescription. For a cabin on the lee side of a ridge, a simple 2-sided wood screen against the north and west walls, 4 feet deep, 6 feet high, with lath screens holding grass in the voids, was sufficient. For a frame house on exposed ground, a full 3-sided roofed gallery with a vestibule was worth the labor. For a small claim shanty occupied by a single man, a rechinking job and a relocated woodpile might be all that was needed. Amasa produced standardized drawings for 3 levels of protection. Level 1, a simple north wall wood screen. 4 posts, a sloping roof, and cross-stacked cordwood against the prevailing wind wall. Estimated labor, 40 hours for 2 people. Estimated fuel requirement, 2 cords repositioned, not additional. Level 2, a 2-sided roofed fuel gallery covering the north and west walls with a vestibule entrance. Estimated labor, 120 hours. Estimated fuel, 4 to 5 cords. Level 3, a full wraparound gallery for highly exposed claims. Almeda's original concept, refined with the improvements from the spring redesign. Estimated labor, 400 hours minimum. Estimated fuel, 5 to 7 cords. No design was described as universal. No design was described as sufficient without maintenance, inspection, and the willingness to consume fuel according to the rules Almeda had established. Sheltered side first, no adjacent bays open during a storm, every emptied section replaced. Amasa drew the plans with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years measuring walls. He included roof bracing for both downward load and upward suction. He included chimney clearance zones. He included drainage beneath every bay. He did not sign the drawings. He labeled them Kettleben Wintering Circle standards and posted them on the wall of Nell's store beside the inspection sheets. Sloat watched the wintering circle take shape with the careful attention of a man calculating how much money was walking away from his counter. Every family that built its own windbreak from deadfall timber and prairie grass was a family that did not purchase sawn lumber, nails, or stove parts from his mill. Every household that reduced its fuel consumption by repositioning its woodpile was a household that needed fewer cords delivered at $2.25 each. Every guide rope strung between buildings was a safety measure that did not appear on any invoice. In November of 1888, Sloat printed a handbill. He had access to a small press through a business contact in Long Pine, and the handbill appeared on the counter of every store between Valentine and Ainsworth within 2 weeks. It advertised the Sloat Storm House, a pre-framed wind-resistant structure with built-in fuel storage, proprietary ventilation, and professional installation. The handbill included a drawing that bore a striking resemblance to Almeda's gallery, an outer shell surrounding an inner cabin with bays for cordwood and a roofed passage. The handbill did not mention Almeda's name. It did not mention the wintering circle. It did not mention that the design had been developed by a widow with $31 and tested during the worst blizzard in the region's memory. It implied that the Sloat Storm House was an original product of Sloat's mill, available for purchase at a price that included materials, labor, and the assurance of professional construction. Almeda saw the handbill at Nell's counter. She read it twice. She set it down and said nothing. Nell said something. Nell said quite a lot, in fact, in the precise and measured tone of a woman who kept records of everything and who understood that a printed claim of originality was a form of theft that could be answered with documentation. But Almeda refused to sue. She refused to write a counter handbill. She refused to engage in a public dispute that would turn the wintering circle's shared knowledge into contested property. Instead, she asked Nell to do what Nell did best. Nell displayed the winter ledger, the original record of the December fuel comparison, the January storm temperatures, the water bucket readings, and the construction timeline in a glass-fronted case beside the store counter. She placed Almeida's original sketches beside the ledger, dated and witnessed. She added the wrapping paper drawings that showed the gallery's evolution from the first dangerous sketch through Orson's corrections to the final improved design. Amasa signed a written statement. It read, "I told Almeda Baines Weller that a house needed walls, not a woodpile wearing a roof. I was present when she set the first post in September 1887. I inspected the gallery before and after the storm of January 12, 1888. The design is hers. The improvements were made by her, by Orson Vickery, and by the settlement's shared labor. I know of no involvement by Harlan Sloat in any part of its development." He signed it with his full name and the date. Nell witnessed it. 3 other settlers added their marks. The statement sat beside the ledger in the glass case. It did not need to be mailed to anyone. It did not need to be filed with any authority. It simply existed, visible to every customer who entered Nell's store, which was every person in Kettleben and most of the travelers passing through. Sloat's customers began asking questions. The questions were not hostile. They were practical. A farmer from near Ainsworth who had seen the handbill rode to Kettleben to inquire about the storm house and found the ledger, the sketches, the statement, and Almeda herself teaching a Sunday construction lesson at the schoolhouse. He asked Almeda whether the storm house was her design. Almeda said the design belonged to the community. She said anyone who wanted to build a windbreak, a gallery, or a fuel screen could learn the method for free at the Sunday lessons. She said Sloat was welcome to sell his version to anyone who preferred to pay for professional construction. She did not attack him. She did not need to. The ledger and the statement answered the question of origin, and the free lessons answered the question of access. Sloat's storm house sold 3 units that winter. Each buyer later attended the Sunday lessons and modified the purchase design based on what they learned. One of them removed Sloat's proprietary ventilation, which was a standard slot cut in the slabs, bokeh, and replaced it with the high vent system Almeda had developed with Orson. Sloat did not print a second handbill. The conversion that Almeda had refused to force arrived on its own schedule. In the winter of 1889, one of Sloat's reconstructed buildings, the rebuilt mill shed, the same structure Almeda had inspected after the Prairie Fire, developed a severe draft along its new siding. The boards Sloat had purchased to replace his burned stock were green, unseasoned, still carrying moisture from the living tree. As the wood dried through the autumn, it shrank. Gaps opened between the boards. The gaps widened in the cold. By January, the mill shed leaked air through its west wall with enough force to flutter a lamp flame from 6 feet away. The hands who slept in the shed's rear quarters complained. Sloat told them to bank the stove harder. They banked it until the pipe glowed and the draft still came through. On a Sunday afternoon in late January, Sloat walked to the schoolhouse where Almeda was teaching 4 families to build removable grass screens. He carried a goose feather. The room went quiet, not because Sloat had entered. He had been in the schoolhouse before, because of the feather. Everyone in the room knew what the feather meant. Everyone in the room had used one. Sloat stood at the back of the room and waited for Almeda to acknowledge him. She did not hurry. She finished showing a woman how to tie the lath frame with wire rather than cord, because wire resisted moisture and cord did not. Then she turned to Sloat. He held up the feather. He did not smile. He did not perform humility. He spoke in the flat transactional tone of a man conducting business. "I sold timber as though timber settled every argument," he said. "It does not." The room remained silent. Sloat looked at the feather in his hand, a simple goose quill, the same kind Almeda had used in August of 1887 to discover that her cabin was a sieve. He did not apologize for burning the slab wood. He did not apologize for the forged wood receipt, for the inflated nail prices, for the fire complaint, for the handbill, or for the year of sustained hostility that had made Almeda's work harder at every turn. He asked whether she would inspect his mill shed. Almeda said yes. She said the inspection would be conducted during the next Sunday lesson so that every family present could see the method applied to a professional building. She said Sloat's hands were welcome to attend. She said the findings would be recorded in Nell's ledger. Sloat agreed to every condition. He had no choice. The feather in his hand was an admission that his buildings needed the knowledge he had tried to suppress, and the only person who could provide it was the woman he had tried to drive off her claim. Almeda inspected the mill shed the following Sunday. She found 11 joints where the feather moved and 3 where it lay flat against the wall. She recommended rechinking the active joints, installing a 2-sided wood screen against the west wall, and relocating the firewood stack from the south side of the building to the northwest, where it would serve as both fuel storage and windbreak. She did not mention the irony. The mill owner, who had mocked the idea of putting wood beside walls, was now being told to put wood beside his walls. Sloat's conversion remained grudging and practical. He never became warm. He never praised Almeda publicly. He never acknowledged the damage his opposition had caused. But he maintained the windscreen, he attended 3 more Sunday lessons, and when a new settler arrived in the spring of 1890 and asked who had designed the windbreak system visible on half the claims in Kettlebend, Sloat said, "The widow Weller." He said it without inflection. He said it as a fact, the way a man states a measurement or a price. But he said it, and Nell, who was standing behind him when he said it, recorded the date. Almeda helped his mill hands because the men who slept beside Sloat's stove should not suffer for his pride. That was the principle, and she did not bend it for satisfaction. By 1892, the Kettlebend Wintering Circle had been operating for 4 winters. 11 homes used partial fuel galleries, most at level 1 or level 2, with only Almeda's claim and 1 highly exposed ridge cabin, maintaining full wraparound protection. The school had a north and west windscreen that Amasa had built with the students during an autumn construction week that became an annual tradition. Guide ropes connected the school, the store, and the nearest shelter. A 3-point system that could be extended to additional buildings as the settlement grew. Each household maintained a marked chimney clearance zone. Each household performed the feather test at least once per autumn and recorded the results on Nell's inspection sheets. Each household maintained bare earth fire strips around any structure containing fuel or grass. The winter circle recorded fuel use in Nell's ledger rather than relying on memory. The numbers showed a settlement-wide reduction in wood consumption that Nell estimated at roughly 1/5 compared to pre-gallery winters, not because the method was miraculous, but because wind protection reduced the rate at which stoves had to fight moving air, and measurement reduced the rate at which families burned fuel they did not need. No family attempted Almeda's original 7-foot depth unless its site was exceptionally exposed. The lesson of the first winter, that the gallery was strongest on its first day and weakest on its last, had become the operating principle for every level of protection. Build what you can maintain, inspect what you build, consume with a plan, replace what you remove. No romance arrived for Almeda Baines Weller. No man rode into Kettlebend and recognized her worth in a single glance. That was not the story, and she did not need it to be. Her major partnership was with Nell Brackett, and it was built on work rather than sentiment. Nell's record-keeping turned the original survival improvisation into teachable practice. The ledger that had begun as a personal account book, tracking nails sold, flour purchased, credit extended, became the settlement's institutional memory. It contained temperature readings, fuel consumption rates, construction timelines, inspection results, storm durations, and the accumulated observations of 13 families learning to live with wind. Nell did not theorize. She recorded. And because she recorded, the knowledge survived beyond the memory of any single person. A new family arriving in 1891 could read the ledger and understand in specific numbers what the winter demanded and what the windbreak provided. They did not need to take Almeda's word for it. They could read the data. Almeda and Nell walked the settlement together every October, performing the annual inspection round. Almeda carried the feather. Nell carried the ledger. They argued about measurements. Nell insisted on recording to the 1/4 inch. Almeda said 1/2 inch was sufficient, and the arguments were the kind that happen between people who respect each other enough to disagree about precision. Rue Weller grew into the partnership without anyone planning it. At 12, she began recording weather observations, temperature, wind direction, cloud type, precipitation. Now, in a separate notebook that Nell bound with store twine and labeled Kettlebend Weather, Rue Weller, Observer. By 15, Rue was teaching younger children to read the spirit thermometer and recording the data that Nell organized into seasonal summaries. By 18, she was the settlement's school teacher, and the schoolhouse wall held two documents: Amasa's construction drawings and Rue's weather records. Amasa continued building. He refined the roof bracing that had saved the gallery during the January storm and published his own set of drawings, not for galleries, but for wind-resistant roof joinery that could be applied to any structure. He credited Almeida's wind principle in a single sentence on the first page. These joints are designed for lateral force, not vertical load alone. The distinction was demonstrated by Mrs. A. Weller during the winter of 1887 to 88. He still carried his folding rule. He still measured everything twice. He had not become a different man. He had become the same man with a more complete understanding of what walls were supposed to stop. Orson wrote occasionally from Omaha. His letters arrived at Nell's store in envelopes addressed to Mrs. A. B. Weller, Kettleben, Brown Co., Knee B. They were short. Orson had never been a man who used more words than the task required. He reported on his health, which declined slowly. He reported on the weather in Omaha, which he found insufficiently dramatic. He asked about the gallery, the improvements, the inspection results. His final letter, which arrived in the spring of 1893, contained no advice. It did not critique a measurement or correct a design. It contained a single request. He asked Almeda to send him the latest fuel consumption numbers from Nell's ledger. He was not offering to help interpret them. He was asking to read them the way a colleague reads a professional report, not to instruct, but to learn. Almeda copied the numbers onto a sheet of wrapping paper and mailed them the following week. She included the feather test results from the October inspection and a note that the school's windscreen had survived its third winter without requiring post replacement. She did not add sentiment. Orson would not have wanted it. The numbers were the message. He died in Omaha 4 months later. His daughter wrote to inform Almeda and enclosed the carpenter's square, the one he had kept when he gave away the plumb bob. Almeda hung it beside the plumb bob on the schoolhouse wall, where it remained for as long as the building stood. Almeda proved up the Weller claim in 1889, completing the 5-year residence requirement and securing permanent title to 160 acres of timbered river frontage along the Niobrara, the land that Sloat had offered to buy for $120, the land that was supposed to pass to his control when winter drove her away, remained in the Weller name. She did not build a new house immediately. When she finally replaced the original cabin in 1894, the new structure was built with Amasa's joinery, Nell's measurements, and the principles the first winter had taught her. It had a protected entrance. It had deliberate wind screens against the north and west walls. It had repairable chinking designed to be inspected and maintained rather than ignored. It had roof bracing against both downward and lateral force. It had a safe wood court with bare earth between the fuel and the chimney. It had guide ropes running to the school and to Nell's store. It did not have a 7-foot gallery. It did not need one. The new cabin was built correctly from the start by people who understood what the wind could do. The massive, continuous shell that had saved 14 lives in January of 1888 had been the answer to a specific failure, a leaking, bowed, underheated cabin that could not be repaired by conventional means at a price a widow could afford. The new house did not have that failure. It had been designed by someone who knew how to find it before it killed. In the dramatized chronology, Almeda lived at Kettleben until her death in 1907 at the age of 77. She outlived Josiah by 20 years. She outlived Orson by 14. She outlived the original gallery, which she dismantled one bay at a time during the 1890s, as the improved house made its continuous protection unnecessary. The posts became fence corners. The rafters became part of Rue's schoolroom addition. The slabs became kindling. The last of the original cordwood was burned during an ordinary winter that no one remembered, because ordinary winters were the ones the settlement had learned to survive without emergency. Rue recorded Almeida's death in the same ledger that contained the storm temperatures, the fuel counts, the feather test results, and the dates of every Sunday lesson. Beside the final entry, the date, the cause, the name, Rue wrote only 2 words: water stayed liquid. On the morning of January 13th, 1888, Amasa Hoxie stood inside the damaged gallery and looked through the broken northwest bay at cabins filled with snow. The wind had stopped. The air was still and hard with cold. Across the road, his own cabin sat on the east ridge with frost on its windows, and snow drifted against its professionally chinked walls. The water inside his cabin had frozen sometime during the night. The stove had gone cold because the fuel ran out before the storm did. He had spent the night in Almeida's cabin, sleeping on the floor beside 13 other people, in a room heated by a stove that burned 1 stick every 12 minutes and never ran short because the fuel was stacked 6 feet deep on the other side of the wall. He stood in the gallery passage with his hand on the inner logs. The wall was dry. The chinking was intact. The feather, still pinned beside the north wall seam where Almeida had placed it 5 months earlier, hung motionless. He remembered what he had said in September, standing on the road with Sloat and the mill workers, looking at the post she had just begun to set. "A house needs walls, Widow Weller, not a woodpile wearing a roof." The wall beneath his hand had not answered him with an argument. It had answered him with a temperature. The wind that had crossed 200 miles of open prairie and torn through every conventional building in Kettle Bend had arrived at this wall and found nothing to enter. Not because the wall was thick, not because the stove was large, because the 7 feet of cordwood and dried grass between the gale and the chinking had made the air slow, and slow air could not defeat a wall that fast air had penetrated every night since August. The line was not answered by narration, reputation, or humiliation. It was answered by what the gale could not reach. Years later, the gallery was gone. Its posts were fence corners. Its rafters held up a schoolroom. Its last cordwood warmed a winter no one remembered. The settlement that had mocked Weller's coffin had learned to build for what moved sideways, and the lessons lived in Nell's ledger, in Amasa's drawings, in Rue's weather records, and in the guide ropes that children retied every autumn between the school, the store, and the nearest shelter. The last surviving objects were 2 tools hanging on the schoolhouse wall: a brass plumb bob, worn smooth by decades of use, and a carpenter's square with initials scratched into the steel. They had belonged to a man who understood how buildings failed, and a woman who learned to build one that did not. Beside them, pinned to the wood with a tack that Rue replaced every year, hung a single goose feather. Outside, the wind searched every wall in Kettle Bend and found fewer ways inside,